Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Coram. Welcome to those of you who are watching on live stream. My name is Carol Homden, and it's my great pleasure as Chief Executive of Coram to invite you to take part in the inaugural Youth Insight Forum. This feels like a really big day. It is a really big day for us. It's one of the first occasions when we have looked to realise our ambition, formulated in conjunction with our young researchers, to place youth voices at the heart of the research agenda to inform, inspire, and galvanise change in the ways in which we think about and we approach service development. So championing youth voices is one of Coram's core priorities, and it's reflected in the work that we do in services, in campaigning, in policy work, and increasingly in research. And Coram is currently developing its position as the Institute for Children, the only dedicated Think and Do Centre focused on the lives and experiences of children and young people now and for into the future. So this event is testament to the potential unleashed, we hope, when young people are given the resources and the platform to drive and develop research discourse. And it's also part of our commitment for providing pathways to the future for young people to take their place in informing and inspiring the development of capacity and capabilities for the future. And of course, at the root of it is our commitment to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which recognises identity as a fundamental and inalienable right. So today is going to be very much what we together make it. This is about co-exploration of complex identity and complex questions for the modern world, framed through and with the experience which is lived, but also informed by the work that is done across different disciplines in practice and in research. I want to remind you all that the event is being recorded and live streamed, and so it will be available possibly in an edited form after the event. And we want to celebrate, and I want to thank particularly Anthony Lynch and Zoë Lambert for being the first co-producers of this exciting agenda and development. This is very much the agenda they have wished to bring to the fore, following their own experiences and those of young people around them. The structure is that we have provided their research papers for prior reading, so I hope that most of you have read it, and that we are having, first of all, a number of responses to those papers to start to stimulate our explorations and discussions. And those are coming from the academic world, from adoption practice, from journalism and the creative arts, amongst others. And the key theme is how can we build depth and complexity into our understanding of identity, and what implications does it have for us in the way in which we develop and take forwards our practice and our research. So please be active in this discussion. Do not fear. Please bring forwards your thoughts and responses as the whole person, because this is what is going to make this journey really vibrant and rich for us. So thank you for this, for coming, for participating, for all you are about to do. And it's my pleasure to ask our three first respondents to come up in order. We're going to hear from Susan Golombok, Hardeep Matharu, and Tam Cane. And first of all, it's my pleasure to introduce Susan Golombok, who is Professor Emeritus of Family Research and the former director of the Centre for Family Research at the University of Cambridge. In fact, a jaw-droppingly daunting CV, which I won't go into in full length, but her research has frequently challenged commonly held assumptions about families and widely held theories of child development, and has contributed to policy and legislation. And her most recent book is We Are Family, What Really Matters for Parents and Children. So, Susan, the floor is yours.
Yes. Okay, well, first, thank you, Carol and Coram, for inviting me here today. It's an absolute pleasure. And, you know, you've pointed out that I'm now emeritus, I've retired. So when I was asked to look at this report and read the project, I was really excited by it because it's a bit out of my area of expertise. In fact, you know, it's really something quite new for me, and that's been such a pleasure reading, and I really have learned new things. So the first thing I'd like to say is huge congratulations to Zoe and Anthony for your really, really impressive reports. I so enjoyed reading them, and there was so much there that, you know, I'm sure so much meat that we'll discuss today, so many new ideas. You know, it was really a pleasure to read it. In that, you've shed light on the whole concept of complex identities with clarity and really powerful argument, and also very much based on theory and research. So definitely you should be commended for the rigor of your report. I really feel it's groundbreaking work that will make people view the whole concept of identity, and especially concept identity, differently from now on. I especially liked your argument about why it's important to think about complex identities. You point out that an individual with a complex identity will experience the dominant culture differently from someone who matches it completely, and that this will affect their identity development. You say that it may have positive outcomes, being part of more than one culture, but also you emphasize that it may result in feelings of not belonging and not fitting in. And I think, you know, it was really important that you stressed both sides of that coin, because as you say yourselves, often people focus on one at the expense of the other. I found that your discussion of the defining features of complex identities, such as the ability to cross between cultures, the notion of in-betweenness, and shared experiences with others with complex identities in different social categories, highly original and extremely compelling. And you have also clearly demonstrated the value of lived experience in illuminating perspectives that others may not see. You remind us that those whose identity is in line with the environment in which they grow up may not think much about it, whereas for many marginalized groups, it's a critical area of interest and daily struggle, I quote from your report. And through your work, you show that those with lived experience are best placed to shine a light on this phenomenon. I think you've made a hugely important contribution to the understanding of identity development more generally, and that your work has the potential to open up new areas of research. So many congratulations again. So what I've been asked to do today, 4 things. Firstly, to contextualize complex identity in relation to my own research on families, to respond to the report from a psychology perspective, to reflect on the implications for research, and to suggest areas for further research. So firstly, I would like to focus on a statement, it was in your report, Anthony, that focused on family. The quote says, "The framework developed in this paper suggests that the family is not a social category compared to nationality or race, but is instead the context in which the young person formulates their identity." So whereas I agree with you very much about the context, I would also like to suggest that family is both a social category and a context. And in doing so, I think it's important to distinguish between two different aspects of family. One is family structure, and the other is family process. And I think they operate a bit differently. So I think perhaps, at least I'm suggesting this as something to consider, that family structure can be seen as a social category like ethnicity, nationality, or social class. So we might think about foster families, adoptive families, single-parent families, step families, families with LGBTQ plus parents, and traditional families. Whereas family processes provide the context for a young person's complex identity development. So we might think here about acceptance versus rejection of a young person's complex identity, or openness versus secrecy in the family about a young person's complex identity. Your reports resonated with me in relation to research we've been doing at the Centre of Family Research in Cambridge, and Vasanthi Jadva, who's headed a lot of this research, is also here today, on donor conception. So we found that many donor-conceived young people are interested in, wish to meet, and wish to maintain relationships with their donors and their donor siblings who are living in different families. They want to know whether they look like their donor relations, whether they have personality characteristics like them, or interests that they share. They also want to know about their donor's family history because they see this information as relevant to their own identity. So I would suggest that many of these young people have complex identities because they experience some of the defining characteristics of your argument for the existence of complex identities. So firstly, cultural flexibility, but I'm using it here in the much broader term. So here I mean the ability to cross between different families, but also your notion of in-betweenness, living between different families. And your reports also made me think of our research on children with LGBTQ+ families. So young people with lesbian mothers, gay fathers, or transgender parents may also have complex identities. I don't know, I'm just putting this forward as something to discuss. But they live in a world where the traditional family is still viewed as the norm. And they experience, again, some of your defining characteristics of complex identities. So connection across categories. For example, many of young people in these families experience stigmatization because of the sexual orientation or gender identity of their parents. So I think some of the experiences resonate with some of the examples you give in your reports. And they may also experience identity denial. So it's something you talked about in your report, when people deny that a person belongs in one or more of their social categories. So for example, young people with same-sex parents often tell us that their families are kind of ignored in school. So they, the books they read, the pictures on their walls, the films they see are not about their families. It's about traditional families. So therefore, they feel that their family experience is being denied. Or sometimes they're asked to do projects about, say, about their dad if they live in a lesbian mother family and so on. So I think, again, there are communalities there. But I do agree with you very much that family context is also important. So the extent to which family does or does not support the young person's relationships in other families to which they're connected will influence their thoughts and feelings about their complex family identity. And this, again, to me seems relevant to young people who are donor conceived, where parents may keep the young person's origins secret, which can have devastating consequences for their identity if they find out, and also cause feelings of confusion if they don't. Whereas at the other end of that continuum, the parents may embrace the young person's donor relations, making it easier for the young person to feel secure in their complex family identity, which comprises of biological parents and sometimes siblings outside of their immediate family circle. And of course, these issues are also relevant to children who've experienced foster families and adoptive families, or people, young people who switch between their parents, when their parents have divorced or separated, switch between their parents' new families. So that's all I'll say for now about that. But the other issue I was asked to speak about is to respond to your reports from a psychology perspective. And to me, I think probably one of the most relevant areas of research in psychology is research on the role of family stories on identity development. And I'm thinking, particularly from a psychology perspective, of the work of Robin Fivish in the United States. So she's been looking at the impact of family stories on identity development for many decades. And her position is that identity is very much constructed through family storytelling, and it's family stories that help us build a coherent sense of who we are. She also argues that family stories are embedded within larger cultural and historical contexts that shape individual identities, which again resonates with your reports. And that stories that are shared across family members, but also across generations, are linked to young people's sense of self and sense of well-being. She found that those who know their family history well have a more positive identity. She also points out that family stories don't always have a positive impact. She talks about stories of trauma or silent stories being a source of distress. The other theory that I just mentioned very briefly from psychology is attachment theory, because I do think that has some relevance here. At least it's a framework to think about complex identities within. So here, of course, the idea is that security of attachment to parents is central to the development of a secure identity. So from this perspective, as children grow older, they build up representations of relationships with their parents in their minds that influence how they come to see themselves. So children who are securely attached to their parents develop a positive self-image, according to attachment theory, whereas children who are insecurely attached view themselves in a less positive light. So again, there was some evidence for this from our study of donor-conceived young people. We found that those who were more securely attached to their parents were more interested in exploring their identity as a donor-conceived person with relatives in other families. Thirdly, implications for research. So, of course, your new ideas have got implications for all aspects of research, but I think assessment is obviously a key one to think about. You report research that uses a qualitative approach, which I think is very well placed, method of studying complex identities to illuminate young people's thoughts, feelings, and experiences. If we're thinking, on the other hand, of a young person's feelings of security in their complex identities, that's something that might be better assessed through a scale, because, you know, something that goes along a continuum from one end to the other. Sampling, of course, is going to create challenges because there's so many different permutations of complex identities. And also, I mean, in the report, you focus on young people aged 12 to 24, but you don't really differentiate according to age. But obviously, that's something, well, I expect that you'll be interested in as time goes on. And finally, I think there are many areas for future research. I'm just going to mention three that came to my mind. Firstly, what aspects of family context enhance or inhibit young people's development of a secure complex identity? How does the influence of family context vary according to family structure? And as a developmental psychologist, it won't surprise you, I think a fruitful question is also, what are the processes involved in the development of complex identities from childhood to adult life? So I have no doubt, well, you have made a huge contribution, and I have no doubt that it will go on to influence research in this area. It's a brilliant job, so interesting, really original, fascinating, and thank you both so much. Sorry. I nearly had to next.
Thank you very much, Susan. And it's just my pleasure now to introduce Hardeep Matharu, who is a journalist and writer who focuses on the forces that shape identity politics in the media. So, Hardeep, it's over to you. And just to say that Hardeep is the editor of the independent investigative news site and monthly print news magazine, Byline Times, which covers what the papers don't say. So, over to you, Hardeep. Thank you.
Well, it's really great to be here today and to be asked to provide a bit of a different perspective because, as you say, I am not an academic, and my sort of take on this is as a journalist, but also as somebody who's always been interested in complex identities because it's been a huge part of my everyday life. I am sort of the daughter of Sikh Punjabi immigrants. My parents were born in different countries to me and to each other. So my father grew up in British Kenya, as it was then, and my mother grew up in post-partition India. They came to this country about 50 years ago, and me and my siblings were born in southeast London. So I'm completely Sikh Punjabi Indian, and obviously I'm also British. A lot of people throughout my whole life think I'm white and not Indian at all, or not fully Indian, including my own Indian community, who inevitably say I'm a sellout, a coconut, a mem sahib, a gori, all kinds of things like that. And then you, of course, have British culture, which still sees you as outside of it. And so there's a lot of complexity, and I grew up in a sort of lower middle class immigrant household in an area of southeast London where the British National Party had its headquarters. It was on my road and right opposite my house. But through education, I guess, and who I am, I'm often interpreted as sort of from a different class now and very privileged. What I'm trying to say is there's a lot of complexity, and I literally live that every single day. And it was a real privilege to meet Zoë and Anthony about a year ago when I came here to see their fantastic In Between Lines exhibition, which I really think is so original. And I saw a tweet about it, and I thought, on instinct, I've got to go. And I'm so glad I went and met you both, because I've learned so much from you and our conversations and reading your papers, which I'm very impressed by. And I think it's quite a lonely process, isn't it? It's quite challenging navigating these complex identities. And I think just the fact of meeting you both shows the power of actually talking and understanding about these things more. And indeed being here today, and the fact that you two are both at the heart of, central to organizing this and leading it, I do think it shows how important it is to have people with those experiences, who are crafting and shaping what's going on in this area, because I think that level of intrinsic engagement and passion and understanding that you bring is sort of second to none. So as a journalist, I'm often thinking about the water we swim in, which is the political and social culture around us, which the media has an enormous role in shaping. And as I said, a woman of color with a complex identity, I'm often thinking about the inner forces within us, how we shaped by our personal experiences, and also what is the interaction between the social and the political and the personal, and what can that reveal to us about how we are being shaped overall. And I've just got two quite different examples that I thought I've always found quite illustrative of sometimes how issues are shaped by the media. And one of them is a BBC documentary which went out last year, which was a detailed interview with Shamima Begum, who was a 15-year-old schoolgirl from East London, went to join ISIS, and rightly shocked the entire country that she had done this. Now, the documentary was very detailed, it was very eye-opening, thought-provoking, but I was really struck that in that hour-long documentary, there were just 2 or 3 minutes that focused on her identity and her navigating being from a Bangladeshi community in East London, very poor part of Tower Hamlets, and feeling British, the Islamophobia, which wasn't really touched on, which exists in our society. None of this was really grappled with at all when questions were being put to her as to why she wanted to go and join ISIS. And I just was very struck by that, because for me, it's sort of a central part of exploring what could have led a person to do that, but there was no exploration of it at all. The other one is a very different example, which is the England football team, who, we hear a lot about how diverse they are, and we hear a lot about their immigrant backgrounds. And at the moment, with the football happening, I think they're in an advertising campaign, which is about stamping out hate, which is great. But again, we hear a lot about their immigrant backgrounds, but we don't hear about the complexity of the different strands of who they are. So for a lot of these footballers who have grown up come from fairly poor backgrounds, they've now attained massive wealth and status. How does that interact with coming from immigrant backgrounds and how society sees them, how they see themselves? Again, that exploration, I think, is still not really there. I think one of the issues from the media perspective when we look at identity is, first, it's framed as identity as opposed to identities. It's either or, as Anthony points out in their paper. But it's also, there's such a preoccupation with identity politics and issues of gender, for example, which tend to dominate the discourse. And I think that's at the expense of real meaningful conversations which need to be had about deeper issues of identity that are actually relevant to people's lives. I also think, as both papers point out, there's a generational relevance and a difference. This notion of being seen, it's really interesting. I don't tend to really talk about that with people who are older than me. It's our generations, the generations that are coming up, this notion of being seen. What is that? Why is it important? And I also think it's important to say being seen doesn't have to come at the expense of others being less seen. And again, that is a problem of how identity politics as shaped by the media and the culture surrounds us is negatively not allowing us to have nuanced conversations, because it is this kind of either or. We're focusing on some people's identity at the expense of other people's identities, and it shouldn't be that way. May add that I think there may be some possibility for change come this week, when there may be a government which is not so focused on driving divisive culture wars for their own political ends. I think that is important to say as a journalist. Yes, and as I said, there's a big generational gap. So I think younger people, the younger generations coming up, are very attuned to this notion of complex identities. I do think, as you point out, Zoe, because of globalization, because of the digital world, because of demographic changes, these issues are only going to become more relevant. So we do need to look at them. And I also think it's, again, the framing of how younger people being affected by these issues is looked at. So again, I think there is some messaging that comes from our media and politics, almost as if there's a notion that young people are overly preoccupied with questions of identity and mental well-being and who they are. I think those approaches can be derogatory and reductionist. I think it's a very important issue, and I really think we need to look at the implications of that as well. So just to come to Zoe's paper, unique internal conflicts. I just picked out some things that I thought were really great. Unique internal conflicts. Yes, we need to be talking more about what is happening internally. I don't know why we don't do this. Certainly in the world of media and politics, we don't do that at all. But I just think it'd be so beneficial to start these conversations about what is happening within. That's really important. I like that you pointed out, Zoe, about the psychological and social impacts of complex identities. Because again, as I said, there's this notion that it can be framed as a purely personal issue, you know, about how you see yourself. And again, we see a lot of that in the conversations around identity politics and gender in particular. But I think you're right. It's not just a purely personal issue to grapple with. It does have an impact on your development and, for example, your career. So, I mean, I see it in journalism. There's a lot of talk, as there are in many industries, about increasing diversity, having more diverse people round the newsroom, for example. But that is not enough. It's not enough just to get those diverse people around the newsroom. We need to be thinking about how they are reacting and being perceived, what's going on with them internally, how they're being responded to, what identities are they carrying at once, which are conflicting and shifting, which they bring to that role. You know, that level, because I've been in meeting rooms where I sit there, all that's going on within me, and I just sit there quietly, but I'm a diversity around the table. So I think one of the examples that you used about Islamophobia was really good, Zoe, because as I was saying, there's a lot of weaponization around identity politics. There's a lot of political ideology and sort of use of the issue of identity, I think, in a divisive way in the media. And Islamophobia is one example of that. And you cited some evidence of, qualitative research that showed that people can feel both British and Muslim, and actually the more Muslim they feel, the more British they feel, right? So those two things aren't in conflict, as we're being told by the tabloid press and whoever else. That is really important because that shows there are tools which are exploring those complex identities which you can actually use and call upon to counter some of these big media narratives or big sort of culture war issues that seem hard to tackle. Anthony, loved your complex identities framework. I think that's really, really useful. We've talked a lot about it. There are multiple categories, but the categories aren't multiple in themselves. I think this is so, so key. And I remember the first time you spoke to me about it, I just thought that makes so much sense, just on a personal level. And again, my sort of lived experience talks to this. So I'm British Indian, but I'm considered a white passing British Indians in the Indian community. I have less of a cohesive identity within my Indian community because I'm considered outside of that community. In the British community, whatever that is, I'm considered slightly outside of that too because I'm not white British, but people assume I am. That's on the personal level. But for example, in terms of my profession, I'm outside of the community of Black and ethnic minority journalists, for example. So I don't have a sense of community from belonging part of that sort of group or cohort because I'm considered as outside of that and I'm considered as probably having privileges outside of that. But then there are advantages to all this because it's like I'm not in any box, which is also a good thing. Again, you point out having a both and perspective in an either-or society. So important, really, really important. I also like that you pointed out the advantages of complex identities, right? So it's not just a load of people are confused and lost. But this is really helpful for me on a personal level. Wow, it can be so rich and full of, strength to embrace all of these different things. And I don't think there are any conversations around that. As I said at the start, we feel it's quite challenging and lonely to navigate these complex identities. There certainly isn't any notion that there are so many things that come from it. I don't think we're being encouraged to see that in ourselves either. We're internalizing narratives this is really hard. And then just to come to your recommendations, I think really, really useful, especially the need to look at the relationship between complex identities and mental health. The impact that masking can have, navigating these different strands within ourselves, the loneliness of it, the challenges. I think it's really important. So it's linked to mental well-being, really should be a big area, completely as a layman, I think. Also, just generally raising awareness, raising recognition, and having more research. Because again, if you have the research, it's easy to refute some of the narratives which are saying it's this or this, and it's divisive. I think, just finally, people who have complex identities, I mean, not always, but sometimes come from communities or upbringings or backgrounds in which speaking up and talking to others and exploring personal inner issues isn't really encouraged. And certainly from the sort of Asian Indian community I've come from, that's not something that is considered to be the thing that you do, which does make it a lonely and challenging process to navigate, because there are a lot of questions that you're always having all the time growing up. Who will understand? Who can I relate to and speak to about this? How do I resolve some of these conflicts within? And certainly growing up, my parents, my siblings, my wider family, no one would talk to me about my complex identity. And so any work in this area that can further a recognition and a greater understanding, and crucially break some of the shame and the loneliness and the heaviness of the subject, I think is much needed. It can only be a good thing, and it is a real privilege to be here to see that beginning to happen. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Hardeep. Well, Tam Cane is a senior lecturer at the University of Sussex, and she's led research and evaluation examining anti-racist practice in social work for a number of years, developing several very important models of practice addressing and challenging debiasing the assessment and recruitment process, which racialized and minority ethnic perspective adopters. And Tam is right at the forefront of some extremely exciting work, and we really look forward, Tam, to your responses to this research. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, and thank you so much for having me here. And of course, I've worked with you, Anthony, and Zoe on the AFDIT project, and it was a pleasure working with you on that project as well. And it's such a pleasure reading the work that you produced. And I was saying to Anthony earlier that actually when I was reading your papers, my head was just going, wow, this is amazing, because this is something that I feel was missing. And more recently, I was looking at some training around identity, actually, and I was looking at identity theories, and I'm thinking, oh, these don't seem to work. Oh, these don't seem to be fitting in some of the work that we're thinking about in relation to transracial adoption. And of course, when I read your paper, Zoe, you kept on saying, I can't show you the paper now. You have to see it when it's out. And it was really, really beautiful to read. So thank you so much for making me wait. And it really was worthwhile waiting. So now I'm not going to go into the summary of the papers, because I think Susan and Hardeep did that really, really well. And for me, when I was reading these papers, the idea around lived experience and complex identity, the liminality experience and the in-betweenness, and of course I had the pleasure of, which is where I first met you at the In-Between Lines exhibition, and ideas of marginalization and connection across difference stood out to me. When I then moved to Zoe's papers, I thought, my goodness, this will be wonderful for social work students, because what has been coming out quite clearly in the work that I've been doing is actually social workers really struggle to understand identity. And your paper breaks it down for students to really understand. I also think social workers, there is something in there that social workers can use from both papers in terms of their direct work, with children and direct work also with adults, not just really when we're thinking about the journey into adoption, also in children's services and also in adoption, because it really helps to understand what is that experience of rejection, where does the identity confusion come from, and what is it that needs to happen when you're thinking about that liminality and actually when differences come together. And Hardeep, you used a metaphor of a river, I think. And when I was thinking about this, I was thinking, well, I wonder if anyone is in the room, because this is the metaphor that I like, of the bridge, who's been through relationship counseling. And maybe you will know, as a psychologist, Susan, and Schaefer talks about the bridge in relationships. And the space you have between the bridge is always that I think about when we're thinking about difference, when we're thinking about cultivation across difference, when we're thinking about children who are moving from fostering, from home to home, and some of the examples we've spoken about, and those differences are coming together, and I think there's that beautiful space between the bridge. And I think that's what complex identities are. And you all speak about, you both speak about self-discovery and the idea of adaptability. And on my reflections and the work that we've been doing in terms of transracial adoption, actually for a child to adapt, for a child to have self-exploration and self-discovery, and that sense of belonging, the idea of assimilation, all that needs to come from somewhere and all that needs to be fostered by someone, and just thinking about some of the experiences. And often children are looking to their parents, whether it's birth parents, whether it's fostering and it's in adoption, they're looking to that. And for me, that's one thing that I was thinking about, for there not to be that marginalization and that sense of belonging. We're looking perhaps to those people who are nurturing and fostering identity, because it is right that Erik Erikson talks about identity being linked to well-being, which is what we're talking about today. So for me, it's then thinking about race trauma. And Ken Hardy talks about the idea of psychological homelessness that comes with trauma that is related to identities. And I think that's what I was thinking about. And that comes with what you spoke about, I think really clearly thinking about your examples about Islamophobia, the prejudice, the stereotypes, the microaggressions that are also very clear actually, and also in your paper, Anthony, as well. How can we do that in a world where children are going to stand out and they're going to experience discrimination? I think we need to be preparing caregivers to be able to do that, and to do that well, and to do it with confidence, and to understand complex identities. And for me, it's about how do we think about this from a child's perspective who is not able to navigate that, who is not able to self-discover, who is also exposed to perhaps some difficult experiences in school. And I think it's really, really wonderful, and I think we need to be thinking about that when we're thinking about younger children who probably are not able to voice their experiences. But what about practitioners when they're really thinking about children and writing, as we spoke about previously, recording around identity? Are practitioners really seeing the differences in identity? And often I think that is missing. To really have those conversations around, actually, what does that identity mean? And maybe it is mixedness, as it were, but actually within those mixed identities, from the father, from all the caregivers, what else is deeper? And what do we need to look at? Including invisible identities, not just the visible ones, but the invisible. And I think the work of Burnham is really helpful to think about the unvoiced identities, the voiced identities, and the idea of intersectionality in relation to all these different aspects that we're talking about. And I think intersectionality is a useful way of thinking about that. And I also wonder whether we need to be thinking about cultural wealth and what that does to children in terms of the sense of belonging. What do communities do? And I think in your talk around belonging to communities as well, in your papers writing about that, what also can communities do? So I think the question for me is that the point for me is it shouldn't really sit on the individual, the idea of self-discovery. I think it has to be a collective, and I think I like the Ubuntu concept that it's everyone's business. Actually, let's do it together. And then that way, we won't see that psychological homelessness, and hopefully one day we're going to see marginalization disappearing somehow. So let's see what the elections does. Okay, so I think in terms of future research, if we want to reflect on what does this mean in terms of research, and I wonder whether it might be useful to think about long-term. long-term outcomes and doing something that is longitudinal to really understand, and again, really thinking about some of the theories around identity. If we think about Cross talks about we all develop identities sometimes, often, if you think Crosstalk focuses on Black experience in America and says actually Black identity develops from realizing that I'm not white, I've experienced racism, I've experienced discrimination, now I realize I'm Black. And then Ruth talks about mixed identities, doesn't, and they suggest that actually society describes who you are based on your features, perhaps. So then children are then identifying themselves based on what is assigned to them. And for me, that also doesn't quite fit, but how do we work with that so that society does not realize we just prescribed identities, because that also contributes to confusions. Then we want to think about transracial adoption. Is Palmer's work talking about a dance between the different identities. And I was reading your work, Anthony, I was thinking, oh, actually, I can see that little dance, and your work really builds further to that in terms of liminality, I guess. So, and if you're dancing between identities, where are you going to land? And then thinking about, actually, now I'm going to affirm, I'm going to feel quite confident in this sense of identity. What does that mean? And then you still have those experiences of whether you're going to integrate, question mark. You've been dancing, maybe you're not going to land, and the idea of those borders and that border being broken, and then you're really struggling to find exactly where you are. So for me, I think it's really thinking about, we've got identity theories, we've got identity research that's out there, but it would be useful to see how that works within this new concept, within these new ideas that you've given us to work with, which I think are really powerful for researchers as well as practice. But can we also see how that develops along the way for children, particularly starting from a young age, and bring new ideas around how does that identity formation comes about, thinking about the idea of in-betweenness and without really being binary around identities. So then really thinking about digital technology, you've spoken about that, and I think we've had conversations about digital technology and what that means in terms of shaping identities and the role of that in that work, and we know that there's a lot of influence in relation to that. But what about children who can't sift information, who are relying on TikTok, who are relying on Instagram? What does that contribute in terms of confusion and in-betweenness, and then being able to land to an identity they feel that this is one I'm going to claim, for example? So thinking about mental health, I think it's important also then to think about interventions that support healthy identity development. I don't think we have that, particularly thinking about the in-betweenness and complex identities as well that we've spoken about today. What are they and how can we work with that? But I think it's not just about interventions, and if you're thinking about a child, for example, or an adolescent who's then going back home to a family experience that is kind of toxic, if you like, because of the microaggressions and the racism within that home, or maybe not supporting the experience of actually you can claim all these different identities that you have. What do we do about that? Because sometimes we give interventions, but we don't really think about also, you know, and when we're thinking about race trauma again, the concept of healing is not one that is spoken about. It's really thinking about how do we liberate, because healing probably doesn't work, especially when you're experiencing marginalization, discrimination all the time. So, and I'm just wondering whether we can invite ourselves to really think about that, particularly in terms of well-being interventions around complex identities that can come up with, that can also include marginalization. And in terms of interventions, what can we do to continue providing a sense of positive well-being and identity outcomes, I think. So thank you so much. It's really, really fantastic. I think I mentioned to you, Anthony, I would love to use it for students. I think I'll be looking to use it for research as well, your concepts, both of them. And I think, yeah, I think we need to be asking practitioners to use your work to inform practice. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those responses. And, well, I hope Anthony and Zoe are feeling really quite proud and puffed up, because actually the sincerity, depth and breadth of those responses is a tribute to your work. Now, we're now going to move into, do stand up and sort of stretch if you feel that you're feeling a little bit sort of, what would be the word? A little bit sat down. Then we're going to now move into a workshop session to further explore the concepts of complex identity and consider the production of lived experience research. So we're going to give centre stage now to our researchers. Anthony is getting ready, and Anthony's going first. Anthony's a researcher of mixed heritage adoptee, and as you have heard, has been part of the development of In Between Lines, where he co-founded, where he was working with Zoe also. And they are both now also steering group members for an upcoming parliamentary inquiry into adoptee voices, organised by the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Adoption and Permanence. So I'm really feeling very, very proud of them. So now, Anthony, over to you for getting us going on the workshop session. Here you go. Would you like that? You've got yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me? Yes, perfect. Hi, everyone. Just want to say thank you so much, Susan, Hardeep, and Tam, for those lovely responses. And my mind is also popping now with all the possibilities. So, yeah, just a little bit about myself. I'm a researcher working at Coram in the intersection between lived experience and policy. And I do have lived experience of being mixed heritage. I'm Jamaican white, and I'm also an adoptee, but I will be speaking from this positionality as a researcher for this workshop. So I'm going to tackle my paper sort of from the reverse, where I'm going to talk about complex identities and the process of when myself and Zoe were doing the In Between Lines exhibition. It didn't matter where these people were from, whether they were adoptees, whether they were mixed heritage, whether they were immigrants. There was something that connected all of us. And when I was speaking to practitioners and professionals, they sort of believed me, but there was like, we need more evidence for this. So I'm going to talk through that process of trying to systematize that lived experience and generate it. And then also I'm going to go into how we adapt this into policy and practice, because you guys are the real experts. When I was trying to write the policy areas, I was like, I'm 24, I don't know. Like, there's so much expertise in this room, and so I'm going to try and get to that point in the discussion so that we can have real, honest conversations about adapting this and critiques and good things, you know, just the wholeness of it. So before we get to the super academic part, I think it's very easy to start from this, or to read a paper and to just kind of get it in like your conscious mind, but not really think about what it actually means to have a complex identity. So if you guys will indulge me, I'm going to ask a series of statements, and if this applies to you, please raise your hand. So the first one is, please raise your hand if you speak multiple languages. Oh, very nice. Okay, thank you. Please raise your hand if in your childhood you moved to a new area, either internationally or domestically. Perfect. Please raise your hand if you've ever changed your name through marriage, adoption, or deed poll. Me too. And then finally, please raise your hand if you've spent an extended period of time abroad. So from the people who've raised their hands, could you just shout out what those feelings or what those experiences generated for you? Anyone?
Confusion.
Thank you, Zoe. Nervousness, isolation. Excitement, good, yeah, some positive stuff there as well. Yes, yes, good. Connections, yes. I think it's really important to acknowledge both, as Hardeep was saying, not just the negatives, but also the positives of this experience. And so, in this sort of non-academic sense, I think that a complex identity for a person is when that sense of multiplicity, of flexibility, but also dislocation is like the central lens through which they view their overall identity. And yeah, I think that's an important way to kind of think about it just in your head. But anyway, thank you for doing that, by the way. I appreciate that. From a more academic point, these quotes, I hope everyone can see, are from various individuals within communities, and they seem fairly different. Some of them are based in the UK, some of them have Indian heritage, some of them, like the first one is written, the last one is written by a child, but some of them are written by adults. There doesn't seem to be some kind of fully connecting feature or intersection, but there is this commonality of in-betweenness, of cultural flexibility. And it's not just like a racial or a geographical thing, which is why I included the bisexuality point, because this phenomenon exists in multiple dimensions that isn't just related to geography. So continuing on from that, it's going to be very difficult to try and find connection if you're looking at it from an either-or perspective, where you're trying to look for one common feature that connects all of these people. So this is based on what's called identity essentialism, which is that group membership is when everyone has one common essential feature, an essence. And so that is used in data collection, and I think that has its use. But what myself and Zoe, our research, is going to focus on is this idea of a both and where what's known as family resemblance, where what ties a group of people or communities are several overlapping features rather than trying to pick out the thing that unites all of them. So why is this an important way of thinking about identity in research? This graph shows for the past, well, very long time, 150 years, the foreign-born population of the UK, which is continuing to increase. And then similarly, we also have the various ethnic groups of the UK and how that's very much increasing as well. And these conversations are only going to intensify. So it's really important that we have a way of being able to relate to others across difference. I think if we get this wrong, to be honest, looking at like France, for example, or the US, that can lead to some really dangerous places, and we need to find a way to acknowledge similarities rather than differences of people. So how I've defined a complex identity is with an individual who has multiple identities in a single social category. So we all have various identities, racial, gender, class, to anywhere, what it could be. But some of us have monocultural identities. So for myself, I grew up in Britain. I've stayed in Britain my entire life. So for my nationality, I have a monocultural identity because I just have one identity in that category of nationality. Some people have what I call complex identities, where you have multiple. So for myself, again, being mixed, I have two racial or ethnic identities in the category of race. And so that produces a qualitatively different experience of identity and selfhood that I will explore. So my paper was a literature review. So I collected several accounts in transracial care experience, in border studies, let's see if I can remember them all, third culture kids, and mixed heritage. And the aim of it, from a research perspective, was to really show that this existed, rather than saying it was systematic. I don't think that every single person from these communities thinks this way or has these same sort of feelings of cultural flexibility, in-between space, marginalization, and connection across categories. Rather, what I'm saying is that those experiences of having a complex identity produce a tendency to think about identity in this way, or for these individuals to have this psychological profile. In terms of points of interest, but to be honest, things I just found confusing in my research, this touches on what you were saying, Susan, about the role of the family. I found it really difficult to try and articulate the role of adoption and the category of family, not just adoption, but care experience, because I want to be inclusive. I'm sure Millie can attest to all of the really tricky conversations we had around that. But I just didn't find enough evidence for same-race adoption placements or care experience placements. There was no discussion of this cultural flexibility of in-betweenness. And so I completely agree with what you're saying, that family can also be a social category. It's just I didn't want to put something there that I couldn't find evidence for. And I think also for adoption, adoptees don't just have this experience of complexity across families, they have it within themselves. So if they're a mixed adoptee, for example, or if they're a bisexual adoptee, or if they're an adoptee with a disability. And so I really wanted to find a way to highlight that, but again, I just didn't have the evidence, and I think that's the issue with picking accounts from such far-reaching places. So it was hard to find all of the knowledge for that, which I'll get into later. The second one was with mixed identity, and what I was finding from the sources that I looked at was that there was a massive pushback in the mixed community about traditional narratives of confusion, that mixed people are lost and they don't know what side to go back on. And so it was really interesting because whatever paper I was reading, or Natalie Morris's Mixed Other, which is a fantastic book on the mixed experience in the UK, there was like explicit pushback against that, and they only focused on cognitive flexibility. So I found that interesting compared to stuff like transracial adoption, where there are myriad examples of this in-betweenness, and whether that move by the mixed community was a pushback against the societal, was about breaking that societal conception. So I think it'll be really interesting to see if there are any accounts of in-betweenness by mixed individuals. And obviously I can't tell because I've got that double variable of being an adoptee, so I'm not really super biased on that. But anyway, what this kind of suggests and reinforces the need for is more systematic reviews. There needs to be more, as you were saying, like psychological scales for groups where they test out, 1 to 10, do you feel a sense of cognitive flexibility? Obviously, I'm a layperson in this, but I think it's really important to have more qualitative stuff as well, for sure, but also quantitative, so that we can really begin to see when it changes or when it doesn't. But obviously, because there are so many permutations, it's going to be hard to work out how to make that sample representative. So that's basically the summary of my paper and the content, the meat and the bones of it. But what I found really interesting as well was the difficulty in producing this paper and in trying to adapt it for an audience of practitioners and researchers in the youth sector, in the equality sector. And so I kind of learned these like secondary lessons about why this sort of research wasn't being produced and what needs to happen in order to have more of these conversations. So the first one, I think, is due to a lack of the specific peer research that myself and Zoe have been doing, which is a gender-led peer research. And so the normal peer research that organizations do is involving some of the target community in the research process. So rather than just consulting them as research participants, you could get them to collect data, you can get them to analyze the data. And so there are benefits of that where if community members will know more deeply the issues that affect them, they'll be able to have richer conversations, they'll be able to develop rapport, they'll be able to interpret answers and reach more marginalized members of the community compared to a researcher who's collecting information about a community. Peer research is about producing information by a community for a community. I think that peer research does lead to interesting conversations about epistemic justice and injustice, who we count as knowledge bearers, who we count as people who are qualified to talk about subjects. But I really think that organizations need to be willing to have that stream of lived experience and that insight, which is exactly what this conference is about. It's about how do we get a bottom-up approach of generating evidence that can then inform top-down policy decisions. So alongside that, it's not just about consulting young people or involving them in a research process that has already been decided for by an academic or someone higher up. It's about how do we let young people set the agenda, which is what I really hope this Youth Insight group will be. And so that's what myself and Zoe have been doing, where we've been producing, and Millie as well, to be sure, have been producing placements, research placements for young people who finished their degree, want to talk about issues that are important to them, and have access to senior figures within Coram, such as myself and Zoe and Millie have had, and then continue to produce events like this. So I think that's the first reason why we haven't had this sort of evidence given before. I think the second reason is about a lack of intersectional approaches. And so intersectionality, by my understanding, is looking at social problems not just through a single lens, such as class, race, or gender, but through multiple lenses. If we look at poverty, for example, if you just look at it through a class analysis, you're not going to understand the individualized way in which people of colour encounter poverty, women of colour encounter poverty, and disabled people encounter poverty amongst many other groups. So it's important to look at multiple lenses of that. And there's this fantastic paper by Ashley Christopherson called Intersectionality in Practice, which goes into the UK equality sector and what current conceptions of intersectionality there are. And what I've gone for in my paper is called pan-equality, which is where you look at intersectionality is multiple groups, so mixed heritage, adoption, and third culture kid and the others. It's presenting their issues as shared. And so, of course, that flattens difference, that flattens the individual agendas of communities, but also it allows them to connect across difference. It allows them to understand their problems and to form political coalitions. If we don't do this, if we don't think about if we don't think about practice with marginalised communities in this way, then we're going to fall into what I call the silo mentality, and also Christopherson calls as well. And so this is the idea that communities are fundamentally separate and equality areas are fundamentally separate. So like there is like a group of racialized people, there is a group of women, there is a group of disabled people. But the reality is that every community contains all other communities. So if we look at the community of black individuals, for example, that includes women, that also includes disabled people, that also includes adoptees. So what I really wanted to do for my paper was, if we can position these people as, if we can share resources across communities, it expedites the discussion, because what myself and Zoe have been noticing is that there's been a lot of individual conversations about complex identity in transracial adoption, in mixed heritage, in third culture kid, and we'll hear from Ruth later, who has been doing this work for 40 years. But if we can share that knowledge, it helps us to understand the shared issues, but it also helps us understand what's particular to each individual community. So for example, with adoption, that one might be adoption trauma, and the process of healing from that, as well as, you know, reunion with family. So it's important to consider both the whole, to have a holistic approach, which is what guided my paper. So I've given you my thoughts on why this paper is important and why it needs to be considered by policymakers and practitioners and people working in professions. But again, you guys are the experts, and I want to invite you all to have a table discussion about this work and really talk about, honestly, the advantages of this approach, but also the challenges of trying to embed this into his work. So alongside this, could you consider these questions as well? And we'll have about 5 minutes to discuss that, and then we'll pull everyone back. How does that sound? Hello.
Thank you very much for all of that. One of the things that I found myself thinking, listening to what you were saying, is that one of the things that's really opened up the possibility of having conversations with people that I don't know or have never met before, is when I walk my dog in the local forest, she may well find another dog to play with, and inevitably as a part of that, I will get to talk to the other dog's owner. And I'm astonished really that, you know, people who are younger than me or older than me or women or whatever, there's a kind of an openness that kind of very quickly develops, which seems to be facilitated by the fact that my dog is playing with their dog. And, you know, and I often walk away. Actually, there was one particular example where I met a youngish man, 17 or 18. It then turned out that he was from Ukraine, and his family had arrived from Ukraine and was actually staying with one of our neighbours just down the road, and he was walking their dog. So I met him because my dog played with their dog, and he was, you know, telling me all kinds of things about, you know, he'd arrived here, he'd just started at a local secondary school. You know, the issues about adjusting into the kind of sixth form classes, about whether his language was good enough, what he was going to do in relation to A-levels, whether he was going to go on to university. I mean, it was just a kind of an overwhelming kind of series of issues that he was raising, you know, just on the basis, well, my sense was just on the basis of the fact that my dog was playing with his dog. And I was really quite astonished by that, and actually it has kind of led to us having much more kind of open conversations without, well, you know, it's just he's such a nice guy and our dogs get on well together.
Yeah, well, it's about, if we define ourselves by our similarities rather than by our differences, then that opens up so many more avenues for connection. And so this is what I want to do and specifically address with an intersectional approach, is that intersectionality gets a lot of flack because it's like, let's just push people into even smaller, narrow interest groups that then start arguing amongst themselves rather than thinking about the common social good. Whereas what this approach is really trying to do is build connection across difference, and that's not just in the paper, it happens in real life all the time when we do in-between lines events. Ruth and Reken talks in her book, Third Culture Kids, about it doesn't matter whether someone's from Brazil or America or Germany, there is a sense of connection, instant connection that they get that they don't have from either their home or host cultures. So I think it's just about, what I was trying to do was tap into that universal need for belonging, connection and acceptance, and trying to present that in a way that opens discussions rather than like a person is like this or they're like this. So yeah, it's a really good, really great point you made. Let's do the discussion, and then after 5 minutes, if you have any questions, you can ask them there as well. How's that sound? Thank you.
Well, if you when I invite you to ask a question, wait for Lily to get to you.
Yeah. Hi everyone. Ding ding ding. So we're gonna take 3 comments, questions from the audience, and then we'll quickly summarize and then move on to Zoe's. Would anyone like to start with a comment, discussions on their group, anything they found particularly important to raise? Hands up. Yes, thank you, Chris.
I don't think I need this. I think we had a discussion around, so I'll put it into context. My name's Chris and I'm transnational and transracially adopted from Hong Kong. And we had a discussion about the kind of concepts of don't knows and that part of belonging and heritage, etc., in which you just do not know. I will never know. Mm-hmm. I don't know, I will never know. So the challenge, the lifetime challenge has been to achieve a sense of belonging into a culture and a country that has rejected me for a long time. And it's only in my adulthood that I've come to say, okay, fine guys, you don't want me, you don't have to have me, but you know what? I need to be comfortable in myself. I don't care what you guys think of me, but I'm going to get on with my life and do what I need to do to live it. And I was just trying to fit that all into the I don't knows, mm-hmm. into that, and particularly because for my sins, I'm a social worker. I work within an adoption agency as well, which it just gets worse and worse, really. And I think of the children and young people today that we place, where there is, modernising social work or whatever it is, is a huge emphasis on identity and meaningful connections, and actually how we achieve that in a positive and meaningful way. Yeah, and it's great that, as you say, Anthony, social workers understand and are having discussions about identity and the children that we place and those disconnects that that mm-hmm. occur during that period. But it's what we do with that afterwards and how we encourage mm-hmm. social workers, but not only social workers, but also build those connections in a meaningful way. And I still think we've got a long way to go. We're still having the same conversations. I came into this profession 35 years ago. I am having the same discussions today about connections to biological families for children and young people that I had back then. I am having again now, or I continue to have now. So I want to know, and I will take this back, and I will take this back to my colleagues, and I will be raging about it, and raving about it, and all that's Chris again, but we don't have time. Mm-hmm. We don't. And resources. We don't have the time to sit and talk to the children about this. We don't have time to sit and talk to biological parents about this. We don't have time to sit and talk carers around to feeling less threatened by biological families and connections.
Yeah.
So that's my little rant.
No. That sort of navigating the don't knows from a personal perspective, I've really had to try and work out. And while writing this paper, it was like, is my in-between-lineness because I don't know so much about my biological history, or is it to do with this cognitive flexibility and in-betweenness? So, I'd say I make a distinction between content of your experiences and the structure of your experience. And for adoptees, there's a lot of lack of content. We just don't know.
But sometimes I would say, is it so bad? The response that I usually get when I tell people, I don't mind my biological family, I've never met them, I'm never going to meet them, is pity or, and don't you ever want to search for them? Rather than acceptance and saying, how can I learn from you? Yeah. That's okay. instead of which I get that response, which makes me feel something less, and thinking, oh, well, maybe I should. Why haven't I?
But it's like, even if the content, even if you don't know, the structure of your experience and of your family identity still is there. There still is that biological part of yourself, even if you don't know what it is. It's still a huge part of you. So as someone who is not a social worker and doesn't have the lay experience, it's like, I guess for me, it's about openness in adoption and knowing that you're not just part of your adopted family and that there is this biological, and foster as well for me. Like, I consider my foster family a really important part of my identity, and being able to hold all of those different identities where you know the content for some of them, and for others you have to try and make your peace with it. But it's really tough. But it's a really interesting point, and one that I struggled with when I was writing it. In interest of time, we're going to take one more comment because it's fascinating, but there's a lot going on. Yeah.
So we talked about actually how impressive the paper was, and about the fact that the references to children's rights and how important that is, and the importance of underpinning the work with that. It was also suggested about how do we involve children, young people in research, and the importance of that, and how does that move forward? And again, it came back to, I mean, I spoke about my previous experiences where there was a time when there was a real commitment to involving children, and that grew as a total respect. There was a whole children's rights movement, which actually empowered children and involved children in inspections, in services, and getting their voices heard. And that I think over time has been shut down because actually the power of that actually not affecting the changes that were needed. So a lot of those services have been removed and have been dampened down rather than built up. And I think this is an amazing opportunity again to really put that back on the agenda and to really think about how we get the voices and the importance of that, and getting the voices of young people involved in the research, involved in the peer reviews. I mean, I think it is critical if we're going to make the changes. But then there has to be the resources and the investment to ensure that we're going to actually then act on what is being said to make those changes, and a commitment to that. And I think that is a real challenge in this time.
Yeah, well, we hope that the Youth Insight Group can be like a template for incorporating this sort of stuff, especially with the timeline of, I did lived experience stuff since I was like 16 with organisations such as Mind, and I'd be consulted, and eventually got to like positions where I presented workshops at their lived experience festival. And as I'm now aging out of that, my experience is becoming less and less representative of young people today. But it's like, how do we abstract from that experience the content of my life to the structures, to the universal themes? And so that's how I sort of think about this Youth Insight thing, and moving that to policy, is that rather than viewing your lived experience as something that makes you biased, it's actually a portal into connecting with other people. And we've got a ready supply of young people with lived experience who've done degrees, and it's about platforming them because they do have the research skills. And I'm not saying that it's anywhere near like a huge report or PhD or something like that, but it's just another stream that can influence decisions. That means that we're in the room when decisions and policies being formed and made. So yeah, this is the start, but I hope that people can see this and be like, we need to incorporate this.
One aspect of all of this, if we return to the regulatory framework, it says that if a child or young person if a child or young person needs to discuss and explore something about their identity or their history, feel that they feel uncomfortable, worried about, anxious about any of those issues, they should be able to go to the adoption agency and actually say, whether it's through their adoptive parents or whether they do it directly, to ask for an assessment of their needs, and then what might be provided by the Adoption Support Fund or other services that are actually available. So I think I think there's something of an opportunity there. But, you know, I think a lot of what's also been expressed is that, you know, the pressures on the workforce are huge. There's a lot of uncertainty about if I really do ask, am I actually going to get an answer? But the issues about the provision of support, I think, is a really critical one for the sector to grasp hold of in a much firmer way.
Okay. Yeah, I will end it there because we're very over time. And yeah, I just want to say thank you so much for listening and for reading the paper and for having this conversation. And hopefully this can be the start of many more. I did have a summary, but I will quickly go to my LinkedIn and my contacts there. I think everyone will be emailed with a full set of the slides. But yeah, thank you guys and appreciate the expertise. I think it's fine. Yes, of course.
So thank you very much, Anthony. And we're turning now. We're going to keep going with Sam.
Oh,
Keep going with Sam. Promising tea and cake. We're now going to turn to Zoe, and Zoe's going to come and ask us to reflect in her own unique style. And I think you have Zoe, who's now embarking on her career in law, so very well done, Zoe. Has a transnational, international adoption story of her own, but is Anthony's co-creator of Open Minds and has provided to us her own music. Yes, thank you. Through the lens of adolescence and journey of exploration.
Sorry. Thank you. Great. Thanks. Yeah, thank you. How do I change that? All right, thank you. Well, thank you, Anthony. It's a hard act to follow. And also thank you to Susan, Hardeep and Tam for your comments on our papers. I feel very seen. Not only because it was my paper that you were commenting on, but also because I have kind of lived the complex identity experience for my entire life. And I remember about 2 years ago, I was sitting with Anthony and we were talking about, this was before we had done most of our identity work. And I remember bringing up a story where it was a young woman had started her career in identity, thank you. And she had started talking about herself when she was very young, maybe in her early 20s, and she had gotten a decade later, and she had realized that the things that she had said when she was very young no longer applied to her. And so she had shared so much of herself, so much of her young self in that moment, to then be defined by that for the rest of her career and for the rest of her potentially adult life. And I found that quite interesting, not only because of the individual circumstances that could be affected by someone seeing you as in one particular way, but also in a policy point of view, because she'd done all that research, done all that talking about her experience, and people had taken that and used that in their own research and used that to inform their own understanding. But the thing is, not only was that a decade out of date, but it was also no longer relevant to the person that they actually were talking about in that situation, which I did find very interesting, because it's basically they've taken one snapshot of someone's life and used that to kind of proliferate it into the rest and apply it to one big group. And now, having said that, sorry, I'm not quite sure how this works, but I do have an exercise for you guys where I want you all to put yourselves in the position of a high school principal. I've been informed that's the right terminology, principal or headmaster or whatever you guys want to call it. So you're in the place of a principal and you are looking at one student in particular because you're thinking about how to change the next year and how to make that better for your students. And so in this circumstance, we've got like worksheets on all of your tables, which will have which you can fill in, but maybe you might have to share them. So I want you to choose one characteristic, but the foundation is a 15-year-old white British male. And one characteristic that you choose is they must share a laptop and a phone between 4 people. They're raised in Singapore, or a second-generation immigrant whose parents speak limited English, but they're always a 15-year-old white British male. And then when you've chosen that characteristic, I want you to apply these 3 situations to that characteristic. So how will that characteristic change these situations and each different situation. And then you took the impact and then the new identity marker. So, for example, one situation is if you're a 50-year-old British male, must share a laptop and phone between 4 people. In English and literature class, you might not have enough access to resources because you have to share it constantly. And so you might not be able to research using SparkNotes, which is something that a lot of your peers might be able to do. And the consequence of not being able to use resources like SparkNotes, which basically lays it out all out for you if you haven't done high school recently, basically you sit down and you can read from it, and it gives you the analysis and it gives you all that information. But if you don't have access to that resource, then how that comes across is that sometimes you might be seen as less intelligent. You might not be able to say the same arguments as your peers. You might not understand something that other people already instinctively understand because they've read this 500-word summary. And so then that new identity marker is unintelligent or lazy or not focused or not good at school. And so if you guys can do that for choosing one characteristic, and I'll give you 5 minutes to do that in your groups. Does anyone have any questions before we start? No? All right, perfect. I'll let you guys do it.
This doesn't control the slides. This is just so you can see them in front of you. But this does.
Okay, all right, perfect. Thank you. Actually, I do need to go to the toilet. Is it okay if I unplug this? Sorry, I probably should have thought about that.
No, that's so fine.
thank you.
Are there 5 and 10 minute things at the back there?
Yeah, they are. Thank you.
Like, drag everyone back, or would you like me to do it on the handheld one?
Yeah. Do you think it's now's the time? That I should.
that's good.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just need to look for my scripts, which I can't find.
Around with the robot mic, and you're going to have people feeding back.
Yes, thank you. Is everyone happy to turn back to the presentation? Okay, yeah, sorry. Can you hear me louder if I...
Maybe needs to be a little higher. I think.
Okay.
I'll start calling everyone
Thank
back.
you. Okay, is that better?
Yeah?
I don't know. Or is it...
That should be working. I'll just say on that maybe.
Oh gosh, okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay.
Okay, if everyone's ready to return their attention to Zoe at the front, and we'll come back to the presentation, please.
Thank you. All right, now that we've had those discussions in our group, does anyone want to feed back on some of the things that we've come up with? I'm feeling a lot of silence. Oh yeah, thank you.
We were talking a bit about, particularly actually for the Raised in Singapore second generation example, how much the making friends at school situation varies by age. So actually for a kind of 15, 16-year-old, friendships are so much more kind of self-starting anyway. Actually the context can be less relevant, and my lovely colleague who is a student and in that age range was much more helpful on this, but that kind of sense that actually because these are networks you form yourselves at that point, it's a bit different, and actually those differences in the family can just be seen as kind of interesting, curious things. Whereas the situation for example, primary school age children, or if there's more complex needs or there's more of a reliance on your family for your sort of network, then the experience becomes very different and potentially more limiting. So we thought it was kind of interesting that you get this very big shift, but actually that almost could be a positive at a certain age range, but not until you hit that point potentially.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that is really interesting. You actually touched on a point that I'm going to discuss a little bit later as well, how it how it is kind of like so diverse, and how different circumstances can create such a different list of different things depending on your exact personal circumstances. Yeah, no, thank you. Does anyone else want to talk as well? Yes.
Thank you. It's just an interesting point about the Raised in Singapore, because, you know, if people fall into stereotypes, you would tend to think, and I'm just broadening this out now, Singaporean students tend to be quite intelligent in terms of things like the PISA scales. They tend to be much more advanced than a lot of English kids. You may then fall into the trap of this is someone who's super bright, very academic. So the whole load of assumptions can come with just the notion of where somebody is from, which may be positive or negative. So I'll just throw that on.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I definitely get that, and because I was actually raised in Singapore, so I can definitely see how. Yeah, I can see how I treat myself and how I go into situations, and also how people treat me differently when I tell them, oh, I'm from Singapore, or I grew up in Singapore, because sometimes I might have my accent kind of fluctuates a little bit, so I can sound British, I can sound slightly American, and so it's just interesting when you let someone know a particular piece of information about yourself, suddenly it's like, oh, I'm going to treat you this way, or I'm going to say this, or you're probably not going to understand this. But also, yeah, when it comes to different, I noticed a lot of my peers from Singapore who also had a British passport, they came and they kind of like grouped together in different groups because they did feel a little bit different, just because of when they were introducing themselves, they noticed that little shift in how they're being treated. Yeah, no, thank you. Thanks. I think, did you have your hand up as well? Perhaps somewhere where being transgender is more accepted by society and there's less hatred around it. Are they moving into the UK, and is that skewing the numbers? And that's also why they don't necessarily speak English as a first language. And it's this complexity which we don't have any information about, and this was all theoretical. This was the census paper creators saying maybe this could be the case, or maybe that could be the case, but we don't actually know. And so when it comes to allocating resources and guidance as to perhaps money, perhaps guidance, perhaps community spaces, where do we give the resources and the guidance? We don't have enough information about that to actually fully do justice to these communities. And the need for these policies and the need for the interrogation into these policies is only increasing because of, I talked a little bit about these in the paper, globalization and the internet. So globalization, more people are immigrating into the UK, but also more people are moving out of the UK. So traditionally, British people are moving to other countries, influencing other countries, and they're being influenced back. So this is also represented in official statistics. So the Office for National Statistics recognized 3 more ethnicities in their latest statistic than the one that they did 2 decades ago. And for youth in particular, the internet is a huge thing because I think so many people, I think it was like 93% of young people have access to the internet. And so this has created things such as the one-to-many networks. For example, you can go on Twitter and talk to one specific community, and then you can go on Reddit and talk to another community, and you can still be yourself in all those communities, and you can still be accepted, but you won't necessarily have the same restriction, whereas in the past you would have to be all those things at once, and it'd be incredibly obvious to everyone looking at you that you were all those things at once. Now, people don't have to do that. They can switch between different communities and places. Furthermore, young people are forced to consider identity at an early age due to social media design. And I think Hardeep touched on this a bit when she was talking about how people think young people are very obsessed with identity. And I think it's unsurprising when you sign up for example, Twitter, or X as it's now called. You're asked to put on a profile picture, put in a username. You're asked to follow people who are your friends or not your friends. If you don't follow someone, that has a potentially big consequences for your social life, because why aren't you following me? Oh, we thought we were best friends. And so that forces young people to think, this is who I am, this is who my circle is, and this is how I create my community. And furthermore, there's also more access to information about different identities. So you might go on Reddit and see something about being transgender. You might not have never heard about that before because it's not talked about in your community. And now you're suddenly introduced to a whole new community that you could then implement into your own identity. And number 2, people are seeing things that they don't understand. So for example, I think Anthony talked about TCKs, which are third culture kids. And there's a huge phenomenon of switching accents. And I found this growing up in an international school in Singapore. People do switch their accents based on who they're talking to. And if you're unfamiliar with that, it becomes almost a sort of deception, because you're like, she's speaking in a British accent to me, then she'll go away and sound Singaporean to someone else. Why are they lying to me? Like, why are they putting on this front when they're actually talking to me? But in reality, according to a lot of research, this is just how TCKs see themselves, and it's how they fit in. It's not something to do with, oh, I'm being fake around this person. It's just, I have different aspects of my personality. And there are also like bicultural lessons, switching mannerisms and values. What kind of music do you like? What kind of books do you read? And then people highlighting parts of their identity that have not been traditionally a part of a British identity, which I think people touched on a bit before, where we were talking about Islamophobia, but actually being Muslim can often increase the amount that you feel British, because you have a norm to fall back on, which can then let you develop other aspects of your identity. And so this is a quote from my essay, which points out that there are a significant increase in hate crimes from 2023 from 2013 by over 100,000. And I said that this indicated a breakdown of social cohesion and divergence, which is something that is part of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And basically this means that although if we had a cohesive social society, sorry, that's a lot of different words, but all the same, our society would draw strength from its diversity, and it would experience less conflict, which is not, as we've seen indicated by the data, that's not what's happening. Hate crimes are increasing, and diversity is not being welcomed, it's being used as a point of conflict. So that increase in hate crimes is how outsiders, or so-called people who don't share that same lived experience, are perceiving it. But it's not just outsiders who don't understand how identities are developing. For example, in my paper, I also looked at 2 different people who potentially could have been seen as the same person if you didn't know them very well. So you might see someone, Bangladeshi female, you would assume certain things about them, you would make assumptions. But in reality, research done by Horton in 2020 pointed out the extreme differences between someone who was all of these characteristics versus someone who had all those characteristics, but on the surface might seem somewhat similar. So one thing I want to point out, which I found quite interesting, is if someone wanted to practice wearing hijab, so this is when you don't necessarily wear it all the time, but you're getting used to it. In the UK, people start doing that as early as 4, and that's the average. So people would start practicing wearing the hijab at the early age of 4. In Bangladesh, people would start practicing wearing the hijab at age 19. So that's a massive difference because of how people's identities are formed based on their different cultural expectations in their different communities. Because basically what this paper says is that British Bangladeshi girls are frequently rejecting qualifying themselves as Bangladeshi and choosing to instead qualify themselves as being Muslim, and only choosing to really call themselves Bangladeshi when they're dressed in things like cultural clothes for weddings, or sorry, I thought you were raising your hand. Yeah, whereas Bangladeshi females living in Bangladesh always do primarily see themselves as Bangladeshi, and it is that kind of difference and how communities treat portraying a certain characteristic that has caused this. And 3, adolescents do not receive the necessary guidance or resources. And so I only have about 5 minutes, so I can't really go too much into this, but there are all these different theories and frameworks that people with a complex identity will go through that won't necessarily be replicated in someone who lives in a system that's set up for them. So one of the things is acculturation, which is the active choice of choosing how to fit into a society. Berry uses the example of an Italian family who can do all these things. So integrating would be the father who goes into a situation. He's Italian and he interacts with the Italian community, perhaps he's the head of it, but he also joins, he has a local job, he joins local groups, he goes down to the pub every evening, and he interacts with both the communities. Separating is the mother in this case. So this is the mother who chooses not to learn to speak English. She only interacts with people from that community, and she's separating herself from the local culture. And then there's assimilation, which is the daughter, and she knows that she's Italian, she knows that she has this ethnic origin and this cultural origin, but she chooses to ignore it completely to the point where she pretends that she's not Italian, and instead she's British, she has a British passport, and she acts like that with all her friends, she doesn't acknowledge her origin. And then there's marginalization, and this is the son who is like his sister, he doesn't necessarily want to be seen as Italian, but his accent is too strong to distance himself from that community or from that label. And so he doesn't want to fit in with the Italian community, but he's being rejected by the British community because he is seen as different. And the lack of knowledge around this and the lack of resources available means that the next generation is unsupported. I did find it quite interesting, and this is correlative because there's not enough research to link it too far. But young people's well-being in 2020, there's like a research study done by it, and it said that young people are increasing their anxiety and depression, and they're also decreasing their sense of belonging in neighborhoods. So this means communities and people who are actually in the present with them. And Erickson, who I based a lot of my essay about, also says that the consequences for not being able to form an identity or not being able to successfully develop in that way that leads you to have a confident sense of your identity also leads to inability to settle, difficulty to fitting into society, and mental health issues. And so I do find it quite interesting when you kind of link it all together, how young people are becoming more obsessed with identity and then also having more struggles with identity because this complexity is becoming more and more prevalent in society. Are these the things, can we see this happening, and is this a consequence of that difficulty? Yes.
I think all of that is really important. I suppose the thing that I really struggle with is the report that Henry Cass wrote about interventions for young people and the use of drugs and all the rest of it. That report is really very disturbing about how partly the medical profession, psychology, etc., have kind of gone down a particular pathway which is really undermining young people to feel that what they're getting as a result of turning up to those services does them no good whatsoever. So I think everything that you're raising is really, really important, those issues about information about complex identities, but there's something about using that report to make sure that if a young person does actually go to a service, that it's actually properly evidence-based and on the side of the young person.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that's super important. I think all of us, everyone in here is very, very intelligent, but we also don't have that lived experience that says we know exactly what you're going through. Because I think we could take all of these things and we could say we can see this by ourselves, we can have our own experiences and we can see how this could happen. But in reality, perhaps someone's struggling in school, but actually it's because they're not trying, and their friends know this, but the teachers don't know that. And so having that youth-focused research, I think, is really important for that reason, as you were saying, where it is just we need to make sure that we're benefiting young people and not pushing them into another box and then forgetting about them because we think we've done our part. Thank you.
Thank you. We've already come to points where we can see our own duties and responsibilities, I think, no matter which part of the spectrum of professions or organisations that we're part of. So I'm going to now say, please have a break, have some tea. I'm going to be a little naughty and suggest that we might want to just snatch back 5 minutes from each of the following sessions to make sure that we do actually have enough time for tea. So without more ado, tea, and then back in 15 minutes. Thank you.
Hi.
Hi, Ruth. Can you... there you are.
I can hear me?
Yeah, I
Can
can
you
hear
me?
you. Perfect. Yeah, so that screen sharing has worked fine. Amazing.
Yeah.
Let me just triple check it's going across to our screen, okay? Yeah, there we go. Perfect.
I thought I would just show a little bit of the history of how we've tried to name things. It's not a big thing, but my brain is so in pieces by now. I have no idea. That's like, whoa, it's so many trains. Wonderful, it's been wonderful. But my goodness, I will come back to,
I can't actually see you at the moment, Ruth. Have you got your video on?
apparently it will not.
There you are. Amazing. Perfect. Thank you. Brilliant.
Thank you. So that's going to be good if I can screen share.
Yes, so that's good that works. We are just going to, where everyone's just having a cup of tea, so we'll bring them back in about 5 minutes.
That's fine.
So if you don't mind, I'm going to go and shepherd people and sort of get the ball rolling again. And
Not a problem.
I'll give you a couple of minutes heads up. Well, I'll give you a couple of minutes heads up once you start, but you'll be able to hear and see what's going on in here anyway. Once we begin the event again, I'll share the video from here, so you'll be able to see us as well.
Okay.
Thank you. Perfect.
I will practice. No, I won't practice my screen.
We're just getting everyone back into the room, so we'll be starting shortly, but just so you can see me and see the progress.
Thank you.
Have you actually met Ruth? Yeah.
I have, yes,
So when it...
Zoe, does she know I have some slides to share?
we can't quite hear you yet, Ruth, because everyone's chatting. So, so what we won't have this view because then others will see each other up here. So, yeah, I'm gonna. Yeah. Okay, Ruth, just to let you know, we haven't started yet, but your video is now on the big screen, so don't pick your nose or anything.
Right, everyone? Ruth, can you hear us?
I can't. Can you hear my husband? He just answered a phone call. I maybe should go shut the door. Okay.
Right, welcome back, everyone. And it's an absolute pleasure now to introduce Ruth van Reken, who is beaming in, I think, from Indianapolis. Is that right? Yep.
That's right.
Which is fantastic. And Ruth is second-generation third-culture kid, I'm advised, mother of 3 now adult TCKs, co-author of Third Culture Kids Growing Up Among Worlds, and author of
Recording
Letters
in Progress.
Never Sent, her personal journaling seeking to understand the long-term impact of cross-cultural childhood. So following up so well from what we were just talking about around the importance of the long-term view, and I'm delighted to say that in 2019, Ruth received an honorary Lit D from Wheaton College for her life's work, and we'd like to thank her for that work and for sharing her reflections today, which is going to be through a Q&A conducted by Zoe. So thank you and welcome, Ruth.
Thank you. It's a true honor and privilege to be here. I'm just enjoying the day enormously.
No, thank you so much for joining us, Ruth. I think you've been a brilliant inspiration for our papers, actually. I know Anthony actually mentioned you on the pedestal when they were going through their paper. So do you want to talk a little bit about yourself and your work in your own words?
Thank you. Yes, as was said, my father was born and raised in Persia. I was born and raised in Kano, Nigeria. My children were, one was born and all were raised in Monrovia, Liberia, and my granddaughter was born in Ghana. So we legitimately lived this experience before we had any language for it. And so that was part of what I've done. When I was 39, I started journaling, trying to figure this out. Why it was such a wonderful life and truly wonderful life. There were these places that I couldn't name or places of depression. I just didn't understand my story. And so it was in that I began to put some bigger picture on it. And since, for the 40 years since then, I have worked in this field of trying to look at cross-cultural childhood and what the impact is in long-term benefits and challenges for us.
Thank you. No, yeah, I think I really resonate with it as well because from my own experiences, I am also a third culture kid. I was adopted in Cambodia, kind of moved over to Singapore with a British passport. And so I do really find your work very, very interesting. And I would be interested to know, because I think you changed your definition from third culture kids to cross-cultural kids. Are you able to talk a little bit about why that transition happened?
Well, I didn't change it. I just enlarged it. What happened was, I'm going to show you a couple slides, maybe to show you the progression, if that will help. When I began doing this work, there was a researcher, Ruth, who had gone to India in the 1950s, and she was studying people who did business overseas. And she became fascinated with the children of the people that were there. People who had come from one culture, the first culture, they'd gone to a second, which was India at that point, but they had formed a way of life that was different from the first or the second. She called that the third culture, and the kids, of course, who were raised in that third culture kids. The children that she studied at that point were all overseas because of a parent's career, not as immigrants. That was what made a difference. And somehow she said there was something that they shared that was more than, than the differences in their backgrounds. So it started out foreign service, corporate grad, military, missionary kids. And each of these groups kind of thought they were the only ones who were doing it. But when she came and gave us a term, we could start to join our research and our look at what this was. And so the first question was, what is it we shared? Because Dave Pollock came along and did his research, and he talked about this being something done in developmental years. And although it was people from all kinds of backgrounds, there was something we shared that we connected to. So when we looked at that, then we could say that there were four things that were kind of universal, despite the difference. We were living a cross-cultural lifestyle. We had high mobility. People were always coming and going. Either I was coming or my friends were going or what was happening. But expected repatriation was one of the distinctives for this particular group that made it different from immigration at that point. And we kind of had a system identity. We belonged to organizations, most of us in some way or another. So that was fine. But as Dave Pollock developed his profile, based on these experiences, people started to say to me, yes, but, and we wrote the book, and people came and they said, but I am experiencing what you're talking about in terms of identity, in terms of this confusion, but I didn't do it this way. Am I a TCK? Well, the question was, people started arguing about the term, who could be and who couldn't be. And I thought, we're not looking at what the issues are. What if we made a larger paradigm that included the third culture kids, but also there's different ways people can grow up cross-culturally, domestic TCKs, bicultural, mixed heritage, all the things you're talking about. And so in 2001, I said, I want to look at this bigger picture. And it's taken all these years for the dream that I've had to have a cross experience conversation like you're doing today to come up. And I just can't thank you enough. Because in what you're talking about, if we can do what we did for TCKs and say, what is it we share? Then we can also look at what's distinctive. And so in this way, the one thing I know is every one of these people are navigating multiple cultural worlds. What is it that that does to us in our sense of identity? It's absolutely wonderful what every one of you have talked about. And I could have a long conversation with each one of the presenters and the people who are responding. It just really got me going. But I've been a heuristic researcher. People said to me, how can you prove this? And when I'm hearing about all the challenges you have of trying to get people to believe you, I thought, been there, done that. So what gives me joy today is that you guys are talking about this. And when I said to somebody, I said, what does a heuristic researcher mean? And he said, well, you don't have facts and figures, but you listen to the stories and you make some conclusions. And other people later will have to do the quantitative and the other kind of research to prove you right or wrong. So that's where I think we see the different generations. Today I'm saying, well, maybe we could call them culturally complex kids. We could just change it to the next stage. So that's kind of the sum of what I've done, where I'm at, and I could respond in a whole million ways to the different things people have said, including the fact that when the journalist was talking about people not looking at the whole story when they're reporting, I'm just so many stories I have that are in my brain. But again, that's where we've been, and now to join it with what you guys are doing is just wonderful.
Thank you. No, I think we're really excited about being able to have this conference and being able to talk to so many different intelligent people about how things can change in their industry as well. I was wondering how, when you've seen the transition from it not being recognized and then it turned into, oh, we're having conferences about it, what are some obstacles that you think we have gotten over, and what are some obstacles do you think that we still have to face?
You have to convince people. It's so different than the typical ways, I guess, of doing identity. At the beginning, I cannot tell you, people didn't even believe there's third culture kids, okay? Because, you know, it's just too out of the box as far as how we make identity. I tried to have a conference finally for academicians at one point in 2011. I thought, well, we got to convince them. We got people from different disciplines. It's an interdisciplinary study. It was the worst fiasco of my life because they refused to believe. I brought all these kids in that were telling their story and they still wouldn't believe it. And Gary Weaver from Intercultural Management Institute had come, and he was a wonderful believer. And I said, why won't they believe it? He said, because people who are academicians have tenure and they've gotten, you know, their tenure, and they won't let people study this because they don't believe in it and they have to publish papers. And I said to him then, maybe one day the younger people will come who've lived it and they believe in it, and now you're here. So it's believing it, it's people wanting to hold on to what they know. And this is a fluid topic. And Ruth Yusim gave us a wonderful gift at the beginning when we were trying to change one thing, that the way she had looked at it. We said, do we have your permission? She said, I'm a researcher. I know things change. I know things grow. Go for it. And I think that's the point. This doesn't reach a static moment. It is something that's growing. It's organic. It's changing, and it's important. So I love it, what you're doing. Thank you.
No, I do find it really interesting as well when you're talking about people not believing it, and also the shift to shifting different labels. And I do credit a lot of my experience because I went to an international school and I was always told that I am a third culture kid. Then I came to the UK and I realized that not that many people actually knew what the term meant, which I did find quite interesting because I think that was an integral part of me being able to see who I am and being able to kind of experience my own identity. So what do you think are the consequences of people not knowing how to label themselves?
That's when you think you don't belong. Because it's a little bit like the ugly duckling who, until he saw himself reflected in another swan, kept saying, what's the matter with me? And the thing that drives me on and on is that to normalize this is the new normal. In 1984, the very first conference I went to, Ted Ward, who was a sociologist, said TCKs are the prototype citizen of the future. That this is how it's going to be, where people are growing up cross-culturally, people are growing up with mobility. And so he already saw that happening, and that's where we are now. But we have to be willing to be humble maybe and say, okay, how we looked at things in the past was fine for the past, but it's not the past now. And so that's where we're at. But all these differences, and particularly I like the idea what you guys are saying about you can be all of the above. I have an African self that nobody sees. And when you gave me a new word today, I've called it hidden diversity. I think you called it invisible identity or something like that. So we can get our language, but when we have language, we can work with concepts. When we don't have language, all we do is feel and wonder what's the matter with me, which is what I felt at 13 when I tried to go back to the States and didn't know anything.
Yeah, no, I think language is really important because if you don't have that language, you can't even talk about yourself in an appropriate way that actually generates how you feel. And I was wondering, when it comes to language, have you ever experienced someone who is using the terms third culture kids or cross-cultural kids and using it in a way that you don't think is correct?
Well, I think that's kind of right where we're at right now. There are some people that say, well, everybody's a third culture kid if you've had any cross-cultural experience. But then what does that word mean? Because the profile was developed based on the fact that there's mobility and there's, these kind of things, particularly mobility. But everybody who's cross-cultural is not mobile. So what is the difference, or what is it that we can say we share? Somebody who's a refugee is certainly mobile, and they go around different cultures, and they probably have their own subculture, which is fine. So maybe somebody could say, well, they're third culture kids, and I'm not going to fight you on that. But we have to have meaning for our language. So then what do we mean by third culture? What is that experience? I have also, I forgot to say, I have 2 international adoptee grandchildren. So they made one big trip at the beginning of their lives, but they've all both grown up in a, town in Indiana. They feel, I think, pretty American. They do have some issues, I think, with identity as far as, how do I fit when I don't look like other people and stuff. So that's another issue. But the mobility where they're chronically losing their world, like I was, you shift, you take an airplane ride and everything changes. That's not their experience. So I like culturally complex kids because that's saying what it is without putting, like Anthony was saying, I really liked how he separated out that you could be different things within the different kinds of categories, even within yourself. So there's so much to look at, so much to do. What I'm particularly enjoying today is finally you guys tying this to the bigger research, because like I said, I'm a nurse by trade. I've lived this experience. I see things, but now you're really putting lovely language and putting it in some real boxes. And I realized today that I've been feeling for years like we weren't even invited to some of the other parties, because even in the academic community, we were seen as so different that we didn't kind of count because we didn't have all the stuff we do. Right now, there are a lot of people doing research among TCKs, so maybe, that research can come here, but certainly what you guys are talking about reflects back to me about giving more language and understanding to what we've been doing too. And that's what I love, is that we could have a joint conversation where we share what we all know and see how big it can grow.
I do think the community is so valuable, because when you walk around the room and you hear all these different conversations, it is really gratifying to see people taking it seriously and generating their own ideas as well. No, so I do actually want to open the floor up to questions from the audience, if anyone has any questions, so we can get that dynamic. Yes. Does anyone have any questions that they want to ask?
I'll throw out one concept, if people don't know it, about being a hidden immigrant, that how we look relative to our environment is something was referred to, but in our realm, we call that being a hidden immigrant, where people look at you and assume you're something that you're not because they haven't understood your story. And that was the other thing I really liked, the emphasis on knowing story. If we don't know our stories and we don't know other people's stories, in today's world, you can't make assumptions.
Oh, yeah, sorry, we've got one question. Should I?
Okay.
Oh, sorry. Do you want me to just?
Thank you. Just one question, really. In terms of the American landscape and the sort of political and cultural fragmentation and polarization, how does your conversation land in that landscape?
Well, that's a great question. I think originally I was hoping that this discussion would make it better. But I think what we're realizing is what you're talking about today is critical, because what's happening is, what I see is globalization has everybody losing that sense of who am I? And so, suddenly it's like the strangers are coming in and other people are coming in. And the only way people seem to have to make an identity is to say who I'm not. And that, I think, is one of the biggest problems we have in this world right now, is people are defining themselves by who they're not. And that's one of the most critical reasons this conversation is so important, is can I be all of the above, but also, can I go back to what it means to be human? And even in the TCK world, when people say, oh, nobody can understand me if they're not a TCK. I think, no, wait a minute, you're a person first. You're a person. The reason that you struggle with belonging is because we want relationships. We want people to know us. And so does the next person, whether they lived your life or not. And so I think the conversation needs to be brought out like you guys are doing today, because what's happening now is terrifying. If people don't know who they are and they can only say who they're not, we will really have the problems that we're seeing become worse. So it's, to me, we're at a really critical point in history and in life and in all of our countries, is how do we see each other in this bigger picture? As Anthony said, what are the similarities we share, even while we can be celebrating the differences? But a lot of the diversity programs start with difference. And then you can only stay different to be somebody, instead of saying, how is it that we are like, the likeness that we share? And then we can also go to the uniqueness and celebrate it rather than being afraid of it. That's my goal, but it's not easy because we have a lot of fear in all of our countries, I think, because people feel lost in this identity issue.
Yeah, no, I think as we've gone through this day as well, I think it is really difficult to kind of put one pulse on how everything is turning out. And I just wanted to thank you for giving us your time and for answering all those questions. And I think Ruth's details will also be potentially in the pamphlet. So maybe if people wanted to discuss more about the third culture kid, because Ruth really is the expert on everything third culture. But yeah, no, thank you so much for talking. And it was really lovely to hear all your answers.
Thank you for what you're all doing. I'll watch for the rest. Bye-bye.
Let's get rid of that one.
That was fantastic, wasn't it? Just to hear from Ruth with that perspective. And now we're going to move our thinking to practice and to reflecting on, together and individually, on what this means for us. So I'm first of all going to, I think, ask the panel to come up. So we've got a wonderful panel. We've got Hannah Lawrence from our own research and impact team. And we've got, where is she? Irene Levine, who's the Managing Director of Coram Intercountry Adoption Centre, and John Simmonds, who is now a fellow in the Coram Institute, specialising in adoption and permanence. So please come up to the stage. Apparently I'm going to have a chair, so that's nice. Please do sit. Hannah? No, I can have a chair over here, don't you worry. There we go. So we're not going to do Q&A. We're going to have 3 responses, or reflections, actually. It's less responses now to the paper than reflections on our takeaways for looking to the future. So Hannah, you're going to start.
Great. Thank you, Carol. And thanks so much for today. It's been really inspiring. And I've been thinking a lot about the implications for our work at Coram in the Impact and Evaluation team. Just to give you some background, we are a wonderful team of 14 people, and we've got a mixture of research experience, skills, personalities, and identities. But mostly our work aims to look at complex interventions and how they work for children who are involved in social care, so often have complex identities. And we are often funded by government what works centres, so really trying to find out quite simple answers about what works and what doesn't work for children, particularly children who are care experienced. So I was asked to think about how identity is relevant and important to our work. So like I said, we do consider complex interventions in complex environments for children and young people, but their identities are often classified in simplified and reductive ways. And as, to use Anthony's phrase, we don't allow for the sort of in-betweenness. So we don't give the same weight to the complexity of young people's identities who are engaging with these complex interventions. So children and young people are categorised into simplified codes, such as ethnicity, gender, for the purposes and ease of analysis. And second, children and young people often need to answer kind of one-size-fits-all outcomes measures or questionnaires, which also don't allow for ambiguity and uncertainty. And some of you may be familiar with the Strength and Difficulties questionnaire, which is used quite widely for children in care. And also these outcome measures have often been validated with certain groups of young people who perhaps might not represent young people with complex identities. So how identity and complexity is currently considered and implemented in our work. There's certainly a push towards kind of using more randomized control trials in social care, and they're viewed as the sort of gold standard of evidence. And we use these to try and control for complexities and differences in participants to give straightforward answers about what works. And while these can tell us definitively about whether something worked, it doesn't tell you why it worked, who it worked for, and what people's experiences of these interventions are. So as a team, we believe in kind of a spectrum of evidence and blending kind of high quality research, which is brought together thoughtfully to give a fuller picture, which allows for more room for complexity. So we would always push for a qualitative element to our project. I should say as well, I'm a qualitative researcher, and ideally as well, qualitative research that doesn't always use typical question and answers, thinking about creative methods, and also thinking about different types of analysis as well. But also these qualitative elements are often downplayed and seen as secondary to the kind of main randomized control trial findings and can get lost. So the concept of complex identity can improve this by considering the complex identities of young people engaging with the services, which we deem working or not working, but also the complex identities of those who are commissioning and developing and doing the research. So we need to ask who's speaking for people with complex identities in research and evaluation, which links to Anthony's point about peer researchers and embedding people with lived experience in our research. So just finally, greater complexity in our work could be implemented through more discussion about the researcher's role in interpreting research, about people with complex identities, such as talking about children with care experience, and the power that researchers hold in speaking for people with these identities, recognizing that ourselves as researchers hold complex identities and consider how this affects our interpretations through more reflexivity, and also questioning transferring rigid academic research frameworks into the context of complexity and actually real-world research where we have to fit around people with complex lives as well. And finally, as we're doing with one of our trials at the moment, we've embedded peer researchers with lived experience into the whole research process and to support with not only the fieldwork but also the analysis and the interpretation of the findings.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Yes, we can give her a clap. Quite a big pressure, I think, on taking forward this baton, if I may say. So one thing I just want to leave as a question, perhaps to answer later, is, are we doing enough to listen to what people are actually telling us anyway, irrespective of the research process? So if we're talking about living in a globalized, digital-first world, if you can cut out the noise, perhaps, or the offence, there is actually a great deal of commentary. So anyway, it's just a reflection. I think we're turning to John. Yeah?
Yeah. I mean, I have to say that the whole of the afternoon, the whole of this event has been really thought-provoking and really, really important. I've been involved in the child placement sector when I joined BAF at the beginning of 2000, and there have been quite a few things in the years before that where I'd worked with different local authorities and different groups of social workers when it comes to child placement, particularly adoption, but that included fostering too. And we established at Goldsmiths College, where I was the head of the team there, a program of work about child placement and what the evidence base was for child placement, what the objectives were for child placement, and what this sector needed to be doing, both in relation to the workforce and the supporting of the workforce, as well as understanding the particular issues for children who could not be looked after by their birth parents or birth family. There was a legal order that actually required those children to be placed either with the doctors or foster carers. One of the challenges of all of that was that in the early 1980s, my wife and I were having a real struggle about pregnancy. That was a really deeply disturbing and uncertain kind of period, going to see medical professionals about what the reasons for any of that might actually be. But anyway, it never worked out at that kind of level. The both of us agreed together that we would approach both our local authority, which was Camden, and Brent, which was on the borders, to see whether adoption was actually a possibility for us. The response we got from Camden was very positive, and the social worker that was allocated to us was really most supportive, very friendly, very thoughtful about the issues that we raised about what it might mean for us and whether it was the right thing for us to do. There was a particular issue that came up in relation to Brent, where the social worker that we talked to said, would we consider having a child placed with us from a minority ethnic group? And we said, but we are two white people, and we didn't think that that was the right thing to do, so they refused to take us on. That was an uncomfortable and difficult set of issues. Anyway, we pursued it with Camden. As I said, the social worker was very positive. We had lots of talks about all kinds of issues, about settling the child into our home, about establishing a kind of meaningful, sensitive parental relationship with the child. And shortly after we were approved, we had a phone call from a social worker at the Royal Free to say that there was a baby who'd just been born, that they thought that the option was that they should be placed for adoption. So we went to meet the baby, still in the incubator, and got to hear a bit more about what the history of all of that was. A couple of weeks later, we went to pick her up, take her home, and she is now an adult in her early 40s with two children of her own. My son, that was a more complicated issue. It was still Camden. We got, again, a phone call that a baby had been born at University College, and the mother had just walked out of the hospital. And so there was, again, an issue about what the plan for that child should be and whether we were in a position to care for him. We went to meet him and talked to the social worker, and a few days later we again collected him from University College Maternity Unit and took him home. So that was two children and a dog. So he's in his late 30s. In his mid-20s, he established a relationship with an Italian woman, and they moved back to Milan a few years ago, where they've now got two children. So 4 grandchildren, 2 adopted children, or 2 adopted young people. And one of the things that happened last year was that my daughter made contact with her birth mother, and she raised quite a few issues about would it be in my daughter's interest, and could she actually manage it if they actually met together, and talked about what had gone in her life, what had gone in my adopted daughter's life, etc., etc. And that's something that happened, and it was an enormously change agenda for us. The birth mother came and had lunch with us one weekend, and we really got on very well together. So there are lots of interesting issues about that, which I won't go into the detail of right now. But I suppose one of the things that was always important to us was the issue about their identity, both my son's identity and my daughter's identity. My daughter, when she went to school, the only issue that she talked about was that one of her friends actually said to her, "Why do you have blonde hair when your mother has dark hair and your father doesn't have any?" And that was the only issue. We talked through it. We tried to reassure her that sometimes those questions come up for all of us. We all have to find our own comfortable or sometimes uncomfortable answer to all of that. The more complicated issue was when she got to the sixth form. She was doing really very well on both the physics and science side of things, as well as art. So there was a series of kind of questions about, what her direction of travel should be when it came to A-levels. Went to meet the headmistress, and she said that she should continue with both, and that finally she recommended that she go to to do an art course at the College of Art in London, which she did. She did really well, and then decided that architecture was going to be her primary commitment, and she got a place at Cambridge to study architecture. And over the years, she's now qualified as an architect, and is involved with a very, very interesting company whose primary focus when it comes to architecture is the ecology of the materials that they actually use. So I won't go into the detail of any of it, but I just think that there's those kind of continuing questions when, about the first steps that anybody takes, whether it's as an adopter or as a foster carer, in terms of thinking through the kind of significance of the unanswered questions, how one's going to respond to the questions that actually come up along the way. And then you've got 30 or 40 years of issues, as all parents do in one way or another, but particularly those questions about the evolving identity that your children actually have, what it actually means to them, when it comes to their careers, when it comes to their relationships with others. And but I think the thing that's really struck me this afternoon is that, there are a whole set of similar questions about identities and complex identities, which go far beyond what I've just talked about, really. So I think there's a real opportunity for us through this conference and the things that have been said at this conference to think about further developments when it comes to policy and practice and the placement of children who cannot continue to live with their birth parents.
Thank you, John. Thank you. So some reflections on the whole life journey now. Irene, over to you.
I feel really delighted to be a part of today and to have read the papers. I feel like, I should be handing the mic over to Chris, who definitely has a lifetime of complex identities. But for myself, I will say I definitely am someone who has complex identities. As a dual heritage woman, brought up with my white mother, Caribbean father, absent from home a lot of the time, brief periods in care as a child, been on both sides of this coin in terms of, as an adult, in terms of extended family members being taken into care and, being a service user and trying to work out and support. So lots of different challenges throughout my life. In later life, discovering that I'm neurodivergent, I'm dyslexic, and navigating my entire life thinking I'm just slow and therefore working many, many hours into the evening to compensate for being slow, when actually it was never picked up until I was 45, and suddenly woke up one morning, saw an article, and suddenly thought, maybe I should get tested. But today I want to really share with you my experience of, I've worked in social work for 40 years, 40 years plus, and most of that time has been in family placement work, working with children, fostering and adoption. I, in the mid-90s, stopped working in family placements and made the decision to go into children's rights, because actually working within a local authority, managing a teenage fostering team and being told that my job was to recruit foster carers, not about maintaining placements, and we just weren't hearing the voices of the children. They were bouncing about from one placement to another, and it was about the children and the difficulties of their behaviours, rather than it being recognised that our foster carers were not trauma-informed and able to manage and work with these children. So I went and became a children's rights officer, and then managed and set up children's rights services across the country. And there was a real commitment at that time to engaging, finding ways to hear the voices of children, to inform research. We had groups that would work alongside, we trained up young people who would work alongside the inspectors to go in and do inspections into children's homes and in terms of services for children. There was a whole raft of ways of empowering children and hearing children's voices. Something that seemed to change over time, actually. And interestingly, I think we went through a period which is changing again, where children's voices, we talk about hearing children's voices, but how much we invest, how much we prioritise that, I think it's problematic. And as you said earlier, Carol, about where are we collecting that information? There's so many opportunities and places where we could, where we don't. And I don't know what that's about. My theory is that, in part, those children's rights services that were around have effectively, I'm glad to say one of them's still surviving in Coram, the Voice Project, but a lot of the ones that were established in local authorities became participation officers, so weren't experienced social workers or weren't people who could fight, or shouldn't be fighting, be a part of the a challenge and be really arguing on behalf of children. They became more groups that were working with groups of children to hear their voices, but not the challenge element in the way that they used to be. So, but I've continued, I came back into family placement work and adoption because actually I realised if we got the family placement bit right, if we found the homes and the families who would actually be able to give a voice to their children, they would, that would be making the bigger difference. So that's why I came back to family placement work. And certainly, I've been working for the last 7.5 years in Coram IAC. It was IAC, now Coram IAC, doing inter-country adoption. And inter-country adoption is not what you might think of as inter-country adoption in the old days of the Madonna or affluent white people going to China to adopt a child. The families that we're working with, we recruit about 50 families every year, and only 1 or 2 of those families, and actually in the last year, none of them that we recruited in the last year, are heritage placements. So it's African Nigerians going back to Nigeria to adopt children, Pakistan to Pakistan, India to India. But even within that, you have to look at identities and the difference that it makes for children. So we have a reputation about working with transracial. We have a lot of families who have historically adopted, who are transracial and working within the sector. And it's trying to find a way of ensuring we're getting the messages right, that when we're recruiting families, that we're finding families that will be able to meet those complex identities that the children will be coming with, whether that's domestic or whether that's inter-country. I've recently participated in a project, and we've got 2 of the participants here today, which was speaking to adult adoptees who shared with an inter-country element, international element, who shared their experiences of being parented in this country and then their experiences as adults. and shared with us about what would have been better, what we should be doing now that would be different, that would help the children that we're working with. And I guess one of the things very much that I was left with after I interviewed 9 adult adoptees, and there was a real, that thing about in between, about longing, about finding where they fit, was very much a theme that was running through. Even for those that did feel like they've made sense of their world, there was still a sense of something, a sense of longing. So what we achieve and what we're trying to do now within the service, and one of the messages that definitely came across from the group, which we're putting into place, is giving opportunities for children as children to come together, to not be isolated, to meet with other children, to know that they're adopted, to know that they're not the only ones, looking at how we empower those children to have a voice, thinking about education and experience in education, and ensuring that the schools are prepared and supporting children. I've put a series of words here, which I just, maybe if I just reference those to finish, is empowerment is the most important thing. Finding ways that enable children, the children that we're working with, to feel empowered, to make sense of their world. We do a lot of work with our adopters around life story work, and that's for intercountry, for children that are adopted from intercountry, there's often very limited information about their life story. So it's making sure that we provide as much information and fill in the gaps around the area they've come from, what could have happened where, and then building on that story as the child, with the child's narrative involved in that. So talking to the children about their experiences and navigating that with them. One of the things is about giving language. And we've heard a lot about that today, about children growing up and not having the language. So ensuring that you're talking to, that people are talking to the children, that the people understand about explaining and sharing experiences and enabling them and giving time and space for them to be able to talk about their experiences. That it's really critical that our adopters are trauma-informed, that they understand the impact trauma has on children, so that when a child is not wanting to talk about, it doesn't about their experience, or not wanting to share information, or acting indifferent to various things, that they understand that, and it doesn't stop them from continuing to address the issues with the children. That they understand that children may react in different ways and not in the way that you would want them to react, but that actually shouldn't stop you continuing to engage and support your child, and look at how and finding the right therapeutic interventions to support your child to be able to reach their full potential. Racism is a critical, as we've been talking about. I do think racism is still very much a part of and understanding the impact of racism has on our children and on adopters and on adult adoptees. So it was terrible, the Black Lives Matters and how that came about and everything. But actually what that gave voice to was we were talking about racism again. We weren't just talking about multiracial and diversity. We were talking about racism. And I don't want to lose that. I think if we understand the inequalities and the oppression and the impact that that has on families, impact on families coming forward to adopt, what we need to support them in order to support them to adopt, the impact it has on our children, it really is an important part of the work that we should be doing and understanding. We're doing a lot around kinship now, both in intercountry adoption, we're doing a lot of kinship placements. There is another level of complexity about identity for kinship children. I remember the work that I was doing in one local authority around kinship, where the children were elated that they were being cared for by their grandparents. But what they were also saying was, but that completely changed the dynamics within the family in relation to their cousins and in relation to the aunts and the uncles who, because the grandparent was having to give them more attention, provide for them, which created a different set of issues within the families. And I think, you know, we're committed to, and it's really important, kinship, but we also need to be thinking about some of those complexities and changes in identity and different positioning of people in families. So I think I'll probably stop there. I think the most important thing, I keep saying most important, everything's important, is about just ensuring that we are culturally competent and that we're not superficial in our approach when we're thinking about identities and the identities of the children that we're working with and the families that we're working with. Because the one thing that we certainly, I would take from today, and that certainly is absolutely evident in the work that we do, this is really complex. The work that we're doing is complex, and we need time to we need to invest resources and time to get it right, and we need time to ensure that we're addressing those complexities. I can see too many times we have families that have come into country adoption because they've been turned down by local authorities or haven't been looked at by local authorities. We had our family fun day this weekend where we had Indian families who have adopted children from a whole range of different ethnicities, and not just Indian children, but they were not taken up by the local authorities originally. They've come to us and we've then been able to go back to the local authorities and place children with them. And they've working phenomenally with those children. When we talk about transracial placement, so often we're talking about white adopters adopting black children, and actually there is a whole diverse community out there who could deal and take on transculturally and transracially, and they're not just white. Sorry, I probably am waffling now, so I'm going to stop.
Thank you. We're not saying you're waffling. That's okay. So, these are some of the reflections on life journey, on the ways in which research actually needs to use additional methods and research differently. And as Irene says, actually to really keep focused on how complex the situation is for the children we're supporting. So we have a few moments just for people in the room. And I might start just by putting someone on the spot as you think. So I thought I would turn to John, because John is responsible for an entire service, which, by the way, is outstanding. So we'll just have a bit of a whoop for Redbridge. But John, what are your takeaways, and how do we respond to these complexities?
Well, I think in terms of takeaways, I think, first of all, it brought home to me just the complexity of the issues that we're talking about. It brought home to me the fact that social workers in the main definitely need to improve their toolkit in this area and have much more confidence in this area to be able to explore issues around complex identities and feel comfortable in that. I think it also brought home to me the importance of valuing that in the workforce, because again, our social workers and family support workers will bring their own complex identities to the workplace as well. So how we make sure that we understand that and understand how that interacts with the work that they're doing. I think as well, it brought home to me the importance of evolution in terms of how society had, times have changed, how understanding and appreciation of concepts like identity has changed, how the world is much more fluid, how identity now isn't as binary as it was maybe, say, 30, 40 years ago, where identities were quite fixed. There was a degree of comfort in having quite a fixed identity. I am what I am. Whereas nowadays, young people, children, adults are, I am what I am today. But tomorrow, I may be something different. And it's having the appreciation to say, that is okay. And we have to work with that evolving nature of people's identities as well. So it brought home that to me as well. It also brought home to me, I would love to do something like this in Redbridge, because I think, as always, the plug from a borough, but I really do think that there is something about how do we open up these conversations to not just those who are interested. So here we have almost like a committed audience who want to hear these things, but how do we bring this conversation back into our workplaces and have those conversations for people to feel comfortable to be able to say, this is difficult. You know, I don't know all the answers to this. And how does this impact on the work that I do with children and young and their families? So I really did welcome today, and I'd love to replicate this back in Redbridge and in other local authorities as well.
Thank you, John. So, other comments or reflections from the floor? Linda, yes. Got two people on that table.
I've made lots of notes of things that we can think about, but I wanted to sort of emphasize examples of little simple things that people can do. It struck me when John made a point earlier about social workers supporting children to understand their backgrounds, etc. And I manage something called the Bright Spots Programme, which is a survey of children in care based on the things that they think are important in their lives. And one of the things that they emphasised was understanding the reasons why they're in care. And so we ask children whether someone has explained to them the reasons when they're in care. And in one local authority, they had a much higher percentage of their care leavers who felt that they had been fully explained to them. And we were trying to unpick, what do you do? What is it about your local authority that means that the young people feel that this is there? And after lots of kind of backwards and forwards, we just worked out that they have a box in their pathway plan that just says, have you got any questions about why you're in care? And that triggers a conversation that then helps the children explore those things. And the social workers might not know how to answer those things, but they can go away, look at the records, try and find out, and sort of encourage that the role of professionals in terms of helping children keep a record of the history and the things that are there, and then also relaying that information in terms of that kind of concepts of sharing family stories and all of those things, you know, the role of the system in doing that, and that there are simple ways of doing that whilst it still can be complicated.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you. So practically we can make a difference in very small ways is actually what you're talking about. Chris, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I think all I want to say is, for me, it's also about the nuances, the small things that sometimes we overlook that also feeds into a sense of identity and belonging. And I suppose the only way I can kind of describe that is that when my adoptive parents wanted to adopt, they were turned down by the local authority and all sorts of people because my adoptive father was Church of England and my mother was Catholic, and back in the day they were seen as unfit to adopt because they came from mixed religion. So they were turned down. But hey, they could adopt a Chinese child. Let's not go into the nuances of that one. But so, I won't go into the complexities of how I arrived here. But needless to say, I'm here, I stayed here. But growing up, that was the narrative. I'm not saying that they could, that was the fact of the matter, but I grew up knowing as a transracial intercountry adoptee, my parents loved me dearly, and I'm not going to take away from that. I'm not going to take away from my experience within my family, which was great. But I knew I wasn't first choice. I wasn't first choice. I probably wasn't even second choice, because first choice would have been adopting a white child, and was adopting a white child domestically. Second choice was a mixed heritage or other child domestically. And the third choice, of course, that came knocking at their door was intercountry, which they grabbed with both hands. I'm not going, I've never condemned them or blamed them for that, because what they wanted was a child. Then came the local authority telling them not to talk about my difference, because that way I'd be assimilated into a white British society. For God's sake. I know there are mirrors. Not that I don't avoid them these days, but there are mirrors. And then, it was growing up, going to an all-white primary school, being told the assumptions, this exercise that Zoe did with us, the assumption was made, I wasn't a white child, therefore, and I didn't come from an affluent background, my parents weren't affluent, therefore I wouldn't get through secondary education, let alone end up where I am today. And all of that, in an insidious way, as a child, feeds into your sense of identity as you're growing. Yes, I've kind of thrown off that mantle, mostly, as I've got older. And so when my parents said to me, and I think that's where I say it's for me, it's the adults, whoever that may be, around that child who is responsible in some, at the beginning, for supporting that child's sense of identity. My parents did their best. They told me to be proud of who I am and where I come from. But at that age, I had no cognitive understanding of where Hong Kong was. My only example or role models of Chinese culture, this will date me, was a cartoon dog called Hong Kong Fooey and the pandas that were sent over from China to London Zoo at the time. So I acquired the nickname of Panda as I was growing up. And they were my anchors back to Chinese culture, history, and that's what they knew at the time. So that's why now I am so focused as a professional and as a person. My daughter is a proud mixed heritage Chinese white young woman, and Irene's met a boy. Is she proud of herself? Too proud sometimes, but there it goes. And that's why I always say it's the responsibility as well of the adults around children, and particularly children who have come through the looked after system, who've got so many fractured relationships and fractured connections. It's our responsibility to fill those gaps.
Thank you, Chris. So we're going to draw that discussion to a close now. We could be here for many hours with the depth of these reflections, and there will be some opportunities over drinks to share more. But can we first thank the panel, John, Irene, and Hannah, for their own reflections. Thank you. Thanks very much. So we're now our final session, which is a bit more of a relaxed session, and also thinking about that importance of creativity and engagement. It's my pleasure to introduce Anthony back to the stage, and Philip Sinden, who is a fashion and portrait photographer. And Anthony will describe a little more about Philip. So Philip, please come up. Anthony.
Thank you very much.
I left you to introduce.
Thank you.
Just take these two.
Okay.
Would you be able to share a mic so they don't? Thanks.
Hi everyone. We're going to pivot and think about identity in a slightly different direction. We've heard from the past few hours about how identity can influence policy and practice, but now I'm going to think about how identity is presented in the visual medium. And when myself, Zoe, Esther and Ocean started In Between Lines, it was an exhibition that was the format in which we decided to portray our experiences, something that could be seen. We felt it was really important to have text along with the pictures. And when we, in December, were thinking about rejoining Coram and writing our research, we felt it was really important at the same time to upgrade that exhibition and focus less on the text and the stories that we'd written from ourselves, but more on the people, on these role models of individuals with complex identities, that their experience can be represented in a photographic sense, and not in a verbal sense, which is really important, hence why we've written a paper, but also being able to capture that visual element and the strength that people with complex identities have is really important. And so it was very fortunate that I was managed to be introduced to Philip, who is an amazing fashion and portrait photographer who's worked with the likes of, I don't know if you know him, Benedict Cumberbatch, Eddie Redmayne, Rami Malek, an extremely accomplished photographer who's worked in Harper's Bazaar and is it Esquire as well? Yeah, all of them. And then what was doubly amazing was that Philip also has lived experience of being a mixed adoptee. And although that's not going to be the centerpiece of what we're talking about, it was important when we captured these individuals up here and their stories that the photographer also shared that lived experience. You know, getting your picture taken is a really vulnerable act, and it's up to them to guide you through the process, to be honest about when you look a bit strange, which Philip did. But then also representing your sense of self in a way that you find pride in. And yeah, it was just really amazing that we got to have that experience in January. And I just want to ask you a few questions about the process of photography and what it means to you and what it means for In Between Lines going forward. Yeah. So firstly, if you want to add anything else to your intro, go ahead. But how do you consider identity in your work?
I think, I feel like a bit of an outsider here, and I probably shouldn't, and I think that's how I've always felt throughout my life. And then I think finding a camera gave me something to hide behind. I don't know about other adopted kids, but I was very shy as a child, all the way up to my teens. And I think having a camera gave me something to hide behind and therefore then start to express myself. So that was a good way around things for me. And I think things have changed an awful lot in the arena that I work in the diversity of people that we're asked to photograph now compared to 3 or 4 years ago. And that's a good thing. I think I often wonder what people see when they see me behind the camera, because I'm not sure how I see myself, how I identify, so I'm not sure what they're looking at, and I guess everyone sees something quite different. Does that answer your question a little bit?
Yeah, no, it's perfect. So what would you say it was like meeting myself and Zoe, and then also producing the exhibition, which, for context, we managed to find 12 individuals, all with a complex identity, and then in January, we got Philip to take photos at his studio, and then we also recorded, we've got about 6 hours worth of transcripted interviews that after this weekend I'm going to finally go through. But what attracted you to doing this work with us, and how has it informed your photography?
Yeah, it was really great to meet the both of you. I met you first through a friend of mine, and we had a lot to discuss because we have similar backgrounds, but we're completely different generationally. And I think we clicked immediately. You did a great job of organising and finding the subjects for us to shoot. And it was really interesting for me because everyone was so different. And I think they weren't really sure what to expect. I don't think most of them, the subjects that we had, who were all brilliant, had been photographed in such a way before. And I give quite a lot of direction. I kind of know what I want to achieve from the imagery. And I think it was just a really great experience, and also quite a tough experience, because when you're working with people who haven't been photographed before, it's very difficult to coax them into being relaxed, into giving you something, and that's what it's all about. And I often overshare when I photograph people, even with celebrities, with everyone actually. I'll just tell them lots of things about myself, and I hope through that process I'm making myself vulnerable, so that then they will open up a little bit more to me. And I think that kind of happened in the studio. The studio that I have is very small, and I often just use daylight, and you were there the whole time behind another, just sort of blocked off by a piece of polyboard, and you heard me just, you know, sort of going at the people, just chatting away, trying to make them as relaxed as I could. And I think, again, it goes back to that thing of being a very shy child, that I surprise myself sometimes with how forward I can be and how in control I can be in these situations. But one has to be to get the results that you want to get, and that's what it's all about. And I think we did a really good job. You know, I really enjoyed the whole process, and it was really fun. You know.
Yeah, the energy when we were sort of filming and coming into the studio was really amazing, because there was that sense of people coming in, people whose story hadn't ever really been represented, people who'd always had to, you know, fit in or were put in a box, and their full identity wasn't ever really acknowledged.
And everyone was very open as well. People were very happy to discuss their stories, and it became a very moving and emotional process for me, because as you say, I've been through the same thing as all the people that we were photographing, or not all of them, but a large majority of them, and it was an amazing sharing experience that I wasn't really expecting, and I think it showed the vulnerability in all of us, you know, to some degree, and I mean, hopefully some of that comes across, or some of that in the images.
Okay, my third question is, how do you think people from marginalised communities should be represented in photography?
I think they should be represented in a very democratic way, the same as everybody else, and I think that is starting to be the case. I don't know that that's always been the case, but I think the media in general has woken up to the fact that we live in a very diverse world, and that they need to show that. And for a long time, it seemed a tokenistic thing that they would put people on the cover of the magazine for one reason or another. Now it feels a little bit more authentic, but I still feel that it's got a long way to go, and I don't feel that it's completely been thought through, and it doesn't always work. You know, I think there's still a long way to go, and I'm very interested in getting involved in that, and trying to photograph as many different people as I can. And I work with one particular model agency called D1 Models, and I literally have people just turn up at the studio, and they're just incredibly interesting mix of people, and they come from all different backgrounds. And you know, I've shot people who have been in the country from Africa for, like, you know, a week, and yet they come to my studio in Bow. They find it fine, and we spend a great 2 hours together. You might then photograph someone from London who can't find the studio. You know, it takes them like. It is hard to get to, but it just shows you the resilience in some people, and not in others. You know.
That's so funny. It's like in a very hard to reach car park. You look like you're going down the wrong alley when you get there. But we all did, so.
Everyone does, eventually.
It's our resilience, right? And then my last question before I open it up to the audience is, what have you learned from working in the adoption space? Because we both sort of met and were introduced after having started working in this space, and just about trying to find your authenticity. whilst also sharing your story.
And it's something I'm really keen to get more involved in, and I shot a campaign last year for National Adoption Week, and I felt afterwards, I felt that it could have been done in a different way. I wish I'd had more control over the way the imagery was finally used, because I think that there was a much more complex way of showing the people that we were photographing, which would have been much more revealing and made more sense of their story. And I think that I can bring an awful lot to this in creating imagery that is more on point with the target audience. And of course, the target audience in adoption is changing massively and all the time, and that's a really great thing. So my experience was less than satisfying, and I understand that there are various boxes that need to be ticked when approaching this type of thing, but I think that a little bit more discussion could have created some really, really strong images. I think the characters that the subjects we had were all amazing. I just think the end way that they were portrayed wasn't quite right. But I think take a positive from everything. It was great to be involved with it. It was really, really interesting process to go through. It got me onto the BBC Breakfast morning show. So that was a fun experience as well. And I've been making a documentary about finding my biological family, which I've documented. I've made a 30-minute documentary, and I was able to bang on about that on the BBC. So that was a good positive thing. But yes, I'm very open to using the skills that I have as a photographer to work in adoption a lot more. And you have my details.
Yes, and we'll certainly pass them on to the rest of you. I think controlling your image, your story, your narrative is so important when you're moving through the adoption space, identity space in general. And I think that was a really big part of why we ended up working with you, and really resonating with your work and your photography was because you did have that lived experience, and we had very careful conversations with the participants, and I wanted people to feel really in control of their images, the ones that they liked, because you took loads, and the one that encapsulated them was chosen and can be removed at any point as well, because it's interesting when you've given away parts of yourself or of your narrative, and you see them crop up and you're like, oh goodness, I wrote that article like 4 years ago, and now that's coming back, and do I still agree with it? But
I think it was really important that everyone had some sort of say in the selection of the images, and sometimes it's also important for me to take a little bit of control and say you're not probably going to choose the best image of yourself, because you're looking at lots of different things rather than the image as a whole. And quite frankly, in magazines, it's very rare that the subject gets approval of an image that we have taken of them. That sounds a bit callous, but it would be a far too bureaucratic system if that was the case. But the top-end celebrities probably do get a little bit more. So it was nice to give that sort of power to our subjects in a way, wasn't it? And then be a part of the process. And some didn't want to look at the pictures at all, and some maybe found it a tricky experience. But I think on the whole, everyone enjoyed themselves.
That's the end of my questions. Does anyone have any questions that they'd like to ask Philip?
Philip, I was there when you did the. I think if there's more that you can say about how it might be done better, there's a recruitment campaign and a chair of that recruitment campaign, it would definitely be worth having an early discussion. Okay, and I could arrange that.
I'd love to.
Okay, all right,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That'd be
sorry.
great.
Oh God. I'll try and make it quite quick, but we've talked a lot today about using experience in your work and how you use experience in your own work. I work in the research team at Coram. I think it's something we quite struggle with, is how when we're talking to our participants or people that we're working with, we're meant to be very neutral and not use our experience at all. So I was wondering how you came to a place of being able to use it. Was it sort of on purpose? Were you practicing? Is there things you're consciously doing to try and talk about your own experience more? And yeah, about that process, yeah.
I think it is definitely, because when I grew up, it was something to be slightly ashamed of, being adopted, and or maybe that's just that. Maybe that was just the way I felt about it. I had other struggles in my family, but I think, yeah, now I'm very vocal about adoption and my mixed heritage. I'm half Pakistani and I'm half Scottish. And I'll sort of tell anyone that. And interestingly, when I travelled a lot through my work, nobody could pinpoint where I was from, and that became a huge advantage. I would turn up in Algeria or in Italy or in Spain or Greece or wherever, and no one can really pinpoint. So people then sort of maybe were much more friendly towards you because they maybe saw me as one of them a little bit more, which was sort of quite interesting. But yeah, I think also trying to make this documentary, which I've been working on, finding my biological family has been really interesting, and it's very, very personal, obviously. And once you put it out there, and I've shown a few people, it makes it a lot easier. Once you start sharing, it becomes a really, really almost addictive thing that you want to share your story because you realise that it might help other people, and I guess that's the end game. And just being open. I think for many years I was actually quite closed about all of these things, and when you start to open up, it becomes a lot easier, and it becomes you start dialogue, and that can only be a good thing.
Yeah, thank you so much, Philip, for sharing your time and your expertise in producing this exhibition. The plan is that myself and Zoe are going to try and transcribe all of these interviews and show them online in between lines and probably on social media with Philip. But then the hope is to try and get these photos shown physically at Coram's new Institute for Children, which opens in 2025, and begin to visualize these complex identities and just continue the conversation. So yeah, thank you so much, Philip.
Thank you very much.
Well, we're coming to the end of what has been an extraordinary exploration of complex and profound issues in the field of complex identities. I hope you all agree. And I think the first thing we need to do is to applaud Anthony and Zoe as they actually reached a conclusion of their research study with us in the formation of the Coram Institute. And I think some whooping would be in order, don't you, to congratulate them as they have taken their own experiences and worked in support of others' understanding. Thank you very much indeed to both of you. So we now will be, we hope, picking up the baton and taking it to the next stage. And within the Coram Institute, the commitment to the Youth Insight Forum and the placements of young postgraduates who can bring lived experience to drive research on their own terms is being picked up. And one of those is Millie Jonas, who has helped us today with the organising, who is now convening the next Coram Insight Forum, Youth Insight Forum, at an indeterminate date, but we'll be letting you know, looking at consumer perspectives. It's also her birthday, so can we thank Millie for her help and say happy birthday to Millie. And Anthony and Zoe are going to conclude in 1 minute, but before they do conclude, I'm just going to say that another date for your diary is the 17th of October, which is Coram's Charter Day, when we are opening an interactive installation which mingles the voices of the children, the first children in care, right here, with an interactive exhibition produced with young people today to inform the future. So I will see you then, but over to Anthony and Zoe to close.
I just wanted to say a huge thank you to everyone who did come down. I thought it was really incredible the way that we kind of all managed to talk about similar experiences, but also very, very different experiences. And also, just as a note, if anyone wants to leave their worksheets behind, I think it'd be very interesting to see what everyone has written about the exercise we did earlier, because I wanted to use this as a bit of information generating as well as just us kind of talking at you. But yeah, no, I think it's been really brilliant. Thank you. It's been really brilliant to be in this space where everyone's kind of very engaged in what we're talking about. And actually it has very valuable insights as well, because I learned stuff when I was talking to everyone. And it was really quite funny when we went over to that table and I was like, yeah, that's my next point, which is very, very interesting and very, very helpful to me as well.
And I just want to end again by also saying thank you. In terms of our future things, we're going to be trying to produce that exhibition. Hopefully going to try and get our research published in a journal. I think there's been conversations about that. And just a real urge to continue this kind of conversation. Doesn't need to be with our frameworks, but just the complexity that we've been, the operative words, the complexity of all of these discussions is just really encouraging, and how we can begin to incorporate this into practice and policy will be great. And I just want to shout out the people who made this conference possible. I really want to say thank you to Caitlin Kennedy, who's just been so supportive of both of us, been our line manager. Yeah, Oliver as well, of course, for booking things and just being great. But those flowers are not just for Millie's birthday, they're also because Millie has done so much in terms of writing speaker bios, in terms of setting up the live stream, in terms of me freaking out a month and a half ago because nothing made sense, and just being a really amazing sounding board for our ideas and just relentless optimism and enthusiasm. So yeah, thank you, Millie, really appreciate it. So that concludes our conference. Thanks very much again for coming. We'll send over the master slides. Thank you to everyone who's on the live stream as well. This will be recorded, so please share, and we'll be sharing that link. But yeah, thanks for coming, and let's have some food. I was kind of just throwing it out there. I was just like, okay, let's get published.